Chapter 5, Part 1 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. By Charles Mackay. Modern Prophecies, Part 1. An epidemic terror of the end of the world has several times spread over the nations. The most remarkable was that which seized Christendom about the middle of the 10th century. Numbers of fanatics appeared in France, Germany, and Italy at that time, preaching that the 1,000 years prophesied in the Apocalypse as the term of the world's duration were about to expire, and that the Son of Man would appear in the clouds to judge the godly and the ungodly. The delusion appears to have been discouraged by the Church, but it nevertheless spread rapidly among the people. The scene of the Last Judgment was expected to be at Jerusalem. In the year 999, the number of pilgrims proceeding eastward to await the coming of the Lord in that city was so great that they were compared to a desolating army. Most of them sold their goods and possessions before they quitted Europe, and lived upon the proceeds in the Holy Land. Buildings of every sort were suffered to fall into ruins. It was thought useless to repair them when the end of the world was so near. Many noble edifices were deliberately pulled down. Even churches, usually so well maintained, shared the general neglect. Knights, citizens, and serfs travelled eastwards in company, taking with them their wives and children, singing psalms as they went, and looking with tearful eyes upon the sky, which they expected each minute to open, to let the Son of God descend in his glory. During the 1000th year the number of pilgrims increased. Most of them were smitten with terror as with a plague. Every phenomenon of nature filled them with alarm. A thunderstorm sent them all upon their knees in mid-March. It was the opinion that thunder was the voice of God, announcing the day of judgment. Numbers expected the earth to open and give up its dead at the sound. Every meteor in the sky seen at Jerusalem brought the whole Christian population into the streets to weep and pray. The pilgrims on the road were in the same alarm. Quote, Lorsque, pendant la nuit, une globe de lumière s'échappa quelquefois de la voûte de cieux et traça dans sa chute un long sillon de feu, la troupe suspendit sa marche solitaire. End quote. Footnote: Charlemagne, poème épique par Lucien Bonaparte. End footnote. Fanatic preachers kept up the flame of terror. Every shooting star furnished occasion for a sermon, in which the sublimity of the approaching judgment was the principal topic. The appearance of comets has been often thought to foretell the speedy dissolution of this world. Part of this belief still exists, but the comet is no longer looked upon as the sign, but the agent of destruction. So lately as in the year 1832, the greatest alarm spread over the continent of Europe, especially in Germany, lest the comet, whose appearance was then foretold by astronomers, should destroy the earth. The danger of our globe was gravely discussed. Many persons refrained from undertaking or concluding any business during that year, in consequence solely of their apprehension that this terrible comet would dash us and our world to atoms. During seasons of great pestilence, men have often believed the prophecies of crazed fanatics, that the end of the world was come. Credulity is always greatest in times of calamity. During the Great Plague, which ravaged all Europe between the years 1345 and 1350, it was generally considered that the end of the world was at hand. Pretended prophets were to be found in all the principal cities of Germany, France, and Italy, predicting that within 10 years the trump of the archangel would sound, and the Saviour appear in the clouds to call the earth to judgment. No little consternation was created in London in 1736 by the prophecy of the famous Whiston, that the world would be destroyed in that year, on the 13th of October. Crowds of people went out on the appointed day to Islington, Hampstead, and the fields intervening, to see the destruction of London, which was to be the beginning of the end. A satirical account of this folly is given in Swift's Miscellanies, Volume 3, entitled A True and Faithful Narrative of What Passed in London on a Rumour of the Day of Judgment. An authentic narrative of this delusion would be interesting, but this solemn witticism of Pope and Gay is not to be depended upon. In the year 1761 the citizens of London were alarmed by 2 shocks of an earthquake, and the prophecy of a third, which was to destroy them altogether. The first shock was felt on the 8th of February, and threw down several chimneys in the neighbourhood of Limehouse and Poplar. The second happened on the 8th of March, and was chiefly felt in the north of London, and towards Hampstead and Highgate. It soon became the subject of general remark that there was exactly an interval of a month between the shocks, and a crack-brained fellow named Bell, a soldier in the Life Guards, was so impressed with the idea that there would be a third in another month, that he lost his senses altogether, and ran about the streets predicting the destruction of London on the 5th of April. Most people thought that the 1st would have been a more appropriate day, but there were not wanting thousands who confidently believed the prediction, and took measures to transport themselves and families from the scene of the impending calamity. As the awful day approached, the excitement became intense, and great numbers of credulous people resorted to all the villages within a circuit of 20 miles, awaiting the doom of London. Islington, Highgate, Hampstead, Harrow, and Blackheath were crowded with panic-stricken fugitives, who paid exorbitant prices for accommodation to the housekeepers of these secure retreats. Such as could not afford to pay for lodgings at any of those places remained in London until 2 or 3 days before the time, and then encamped in the surrounding fields, awaiting the tremendous shock which was to lay their high city all level with the dust. As happened during a similar panic in the time of Henry VIII, the fear became contagious, and hundreds who had laughed at the prediction a week before packed up their goods when they saw others doing so, and hastened away. The river was thought to be a place of great security, and all the merchant vessels in the port were filled with people, who passed the night between the 4th and the 5th on board, expecting every instant to see St. Paul's totter, and the towers of Westminster Abbey rock in the wind and fall amid a cloud of dust. The greater part of the fugitives returned on the following day, convinced that the prophet was a false one, but many judged it more prudent to allow a week to elapse before they trusted their dear limbs in London. Bell lost all credit in a short time, and was looked upon even by the most credulous as a mere madman. He tried some other prophecies, but nobody was deceived by them, and in a few months afterwards he was confined in a lunatic asylum. A panic terror of the end of the world seized the good people of Leeds and its neighbourhood in the year 1806. It arose from the following circumstances. A hen in a village close by laid eggs, on which were inscribed the words, "Christ is coming." Great numbers visited the spot and examined these wondrous eggs, convinced that the day of judgment was near at hand. Like sailors in a storm, expecting every instant to go to the bottom, the believers suddenly became religious, prayed violently, and flattered themselves that they repented them of their evil courses. But a plain tale soon put them down, and quenched their religion entirely. Some gentlemen, hearing of the matter, went one fine morning and caught the poor hen in the act of laying one of her miraculous eggs. They soon ascertained beyond doubt that the egg had been inscribed with some corrosive ink, and cruelly forced up again into the bird's body. At this explanation those who had prayed now laughed, and the world wagged as merrily as of yore. At the time of the plague in Milan, in 1630, of which so affecting a description has been left us by Ripamonte in his interesting work De Peste Mediolani, the people, in their distress, listened with avidity to the predictions of astrologers and other impostors. It is singular enough that the plague was foretold a year before it broke out. A large comet appearing in 1628, the opinions of astrologers were divided with regard to it. Some insisted that it was a forerunner of a bloody war. Others maintained that it predicted a great famine, but the greater number, founding their judgment upon its pale colour, thought it portended a pestilence. The fulfilment of their prediction brought them into great repute while the plague was raging. Other prophecies were current, which were asserted to have been delivered hundreds of years previously. They had a most pernicious effect upon the mind of the vulgar, as they induced a belief in fatalism. By taking away the hope of recovery, that greatest balm in every malady, they increased threefold the ravages of the disease. One singular prediction almost drove the unhappy people mad. An ancient couplet, preserved for ages by tradition, foretold that in the year 1630 the devil would poison all Milan. Early one morning in April, and before the pestilence had reached its height, the passengers were surprised to see that all the doors in the principal streets of the city were marked with a curious daub or spot, as if a sponge, filled with the purulent matter of the plague sores, had been pressed against them. The whole population were speedily in movement to remark the strange appearance, and the greatest alarm spread rapidly. Every means was taken to discover the perpetrators, but in vain. At last the ancient prophecy was remembered, and prayers were offered up in all the churches, that the machinations of the evil one might be defeated. Many persons were of opinion that the emissaries of foreign powers were employed to spread infectious poison over the city, but by far the greater number were convinced that the powers of hell had conspired against them, and that the infection was spread by supernatural agencies. In the meantime the plague increased fearfully. Distrust and alarm took possession of every mind. Everything was believed to have been poisoned by the devil: the waters of the wells, the standing corn in the fields, and the fruit upon the trees. It was believed that all objects of touch were poisoned: the walls of the houses, the pavements of the streets, and the very handles of the doors. The populace were raised to a pitch of ungovernable fury. A strict watch was kept for the devil's emissaries, and any man who wanted to be rid of an enemy had only to say that he had seen him besmearing a door with ointment. His fate was certain death at the hands of the mob. An old man, upwards of 80 years of age, a daily frequenter of the church of St. Antonio, was seen, on rising from his knees, to wipe with the skirt of his cloak the stool on which he was about to sit down. A cry was raised immediately that he was besmearing the seat with poison. A mob of women, by whom the church was crowded, seized hold of the feeble old man and dragged him out by the hair of his head, with horrid oaths and imprecations. He was trailed in this manner through the mire to the house of the municipal judge, that he might be put to the rack and forced to discover his accomplices, but he expired on the way. Many other victims were sacrificed to the popular fury. One Maire, who appears to have been half a chemist and half a barber, was accused of being in league with the devil to poison Milan. His house was surrounded, and a number of chemical preparations were found. The poor man asserted that they were intended as preservatives against infection, but some physicians, to whom they were submitted, declared they were poison. Maire was put to the rack, where he for a long time asserted his innocence. He confessed at last, when his courage was worn down by torture, that he was in league with the devil and foreign powers to poison the whole city, that he had anointed the doors and infected the fountains of water. He named several persons as his accomplices, who were apprehended and put to a similar torture. They were all found guilty and executed. Maire's house was razed to the ground, and a column erected on the spot, with an inscription to commemorate his guilt. While the public mind was filled with these marvellous occurrences, the plague continued to increase. The crowds that were brought together to witness the executions spread the infection among one another. But the fury of their passions and the extent of their credulity kept pace with the violence of the plague. Every wonderful and preposterous story was believed. One, in particular, occupied them to the exclusion for a long time of every other. The devil himself had been seen. He had taken a house in Milan, in which he prepared his poisonous unguents, and furnished them to his emissaries for distribution. One man had brooded over such tales till he became firmly convinced that the wild nights of his own fancy were realities. He stationed himself in the market-place of Milan, and related the following story to the crowds that gathered round him. He was standing, he said, at the door of the cathedral late in the evening, and when there was nobody nigh, he saw a dark-coloured chariot, drawn by 6 milk-white horses, stop close beside him. The chariot was followed by a numerous train of domestics in dark liveries, mounted on dark-coloured steeds. In the chariot there sat a tall stranger of a majestic aspect. His long black hair floated in the wind, fire flashed from his large black eyes, and a curl of ineffable scorn dwelt upon his lips. The look of the stranger was so sublime that he was awed, and trembled with fear when he gazed upon him. His complexion was much darker than that of any man he had ever seen, and the atmosphere around him was hot and suffocating. He perceived immediately that he was a being of another world. The stranger, seeing his trepidation, asked him blandly, yet majestically, to mount beside him. He had no power to refuse, and before he was well aware that he had moved, he found himself in the chariot. Onwards they went, with the rapidity of the wind, the stranger speaking no word, until they stopped before a door in the high street of Milan. There was a crowd of people in the street, but, to his great surprise, no one seemed to notice the extraordinary equipage and its numerous train. From this he concluded that they were invisible. The house at which they stopped appeared to be a shop, but the interior was like a vast half-ruined palace. He went with his mysterious guide through several large and dimly lighted rooms. In one of them, surrounded by huge pillars of marble, a senate of ghosts was assembled, debating on the progress of the plague. Other parts of the building were enveloped in the thickest darkness, illumined at intervals by flashes of lightning, which allowed him to distinguish a number of gibing and chattering skeletons running about and pursuing each other, or playing at leapfrog over one another's backs. At the rear of the mansion was a wild, uncultivated plot of ground, in the midst of which arose a black rock. Down its sides rushed with fearful noise a torrent of poisonous water, which, insinuating itself through the soil, penetrated to all the springs of the city, and rendered them unfit for use. After he had been shown all this, the stranger led him into another large chamber, filled with gold and precious stones, all of which he offered him if he would kneel down and worship him, and consent to smear the doors and houses of Milan with a pestiferous salve which he held out to him. He now knew him to be the devil, and in that moment of temptation prayed to God to give him strength to resist. His prayer was heard. He refused the bribe. The stranger scowled horribly upon him. A loud clap of thunder burst over his head, the vivid lightning flashed in his eyes, and the next moment he found himself standing alone at the porch of the cathedral. He repeated this strange tale day after day, without any variation, and all the populace were firm believers in its truth. Repeated search was made to discover the mysterious house, but all in vain. The man pointed out several as resembling it, which were searched by the police, but the demon of the pestilence was not to be found, nor the hall of ghosts, nor the poisonous fountain. But the minds of the people were so impressed with the idea that scores of witnesses, half crazed by disease, came forward to swear that they also had seen the diabolical stranger and had heard his chariot, drawn by the milk-white steeds, rumbling over the streets at midnight with a sound louder than thunder. The number of persons who confessed that they were employed by the devil to distribute poison is almost incredible. An epidemic frenzy was abroad, which seemed to be as contagious as the plague. Imagination was as disordered as the body, and day after day persons came voluntarily forward to accuse themselves. They generally had the marks of disease upon them, and some died in the act of confession. During the Great Plague of London in 1665, the people listened with similar avidity to the predictions of quacks and fanatics. Defoe says that at that time the people were more addicted to prophecies and astronomical conjurations, dreams and old wives' tales than ever they were before or since. Almanacs and their predictions frightened them terribly. Even the year before the plague broke out, they were greatly alarmed by the comet which then appeared, and anticipated that famine, pestilence, or fire would follow. Enthusiasts, while yet the disease had made but little progress, ran about the streets, predicting that in a few days London would be destroyed. A still more singular instance of their faith in predictions occurred in London in the year 1524. The city swarmed at that time with fortune-tellers and astrologers, who were consulted daily by people of every class in society on the secrets of futurity. As early as the month of June 1523, several of them concurred in predicting that, on the 1st day of February 1524, the waters of the Thames would swell to such a height as to overflow the whole city of London, and wash away 10,000 houses. The prophecy met implicit belief. It was reiterated with the utmost confidence month after month, until so much alarm was excited that many families packed up their goods and removed into Kent and Essex. As the time drew nigh, the number of these emigrants increased. In January, droves of workmen might be seen, followed by their wives and children, trudging on foot to the villages within 15 or 20 miles to await the catastrophe. People of a higher class were also to be seen in wagons and other vehicles bound on a similar errand. By the middle of January at least 20,000 persons had quitted the doomed city, leaving nothing but the bare walls of their homes to be swept away by the impending floods. Many of the richer sort took up their abode on the heights of Highgate, Hampstead, and Blackheath, and some erected tents as far away as Waltham Abbey on the north, and Croydon on the south of the Thames. Bolton, the prior of St. Bartholomew's, was so alarmed that he erected, at a very great expense, a sort of fortress at Harrow-on-the-Hill, which he stocked with provisions for 2 months. On the 24th of January, a week before the awful day which was to see the destruction of London, he removed thither, with the brethren and officers of the priory and all his household. A number of boats were conveyed in waggons to his fortress, furnished abundantly with expert rowers, in case the flood, reaching so high as Harrow, should force them to go farther for a resting place. Many wealthy citizens prayed to share his retreat, but the prior, with a prudent forethought, admitted only his personal friends and those who brought stores of eatables for the blockade. At last the morn, big with the fate of London, appeared in the east. The wondering crowds were astir at an early hour to watch the rising of the waters. The inundation, it was predicted, would be gradual, not sudden, so that they expected to have plenty of time to escape as soon as they saw the bosom of old Thames heave beyond the usual mark. But the majority were too much alarmed to trust to this, and thought themselves safer 10 or 20 miles off. The Thames, unmindful of the foolish crowds upon its banks, flowed on quietly as of yore. The tide ebbed at its usual hour, flowed to its usual height, and then ebbed again, just as if 20 astrologers had not pledged their words to the contrary. Blank were their faces as evening approached, and as blank grew the faces of the citizens to think that they had made such fools of themselves. At last night set in, and the obstinate river would not lift its waters to sweep away even one house out of the 10,000. Still, however, the people were afraid to go to sleep. Many hundreds remained up till dawn of the next day, lest the deluge should come upon them like a thief in the night. On the morrow it was seriously discussed whether it would not be advisable to duck the false prophets in the river. Luckily for them, they thought of an expedient which allayed the popular fury. They asserted that by an error, a very slight one, of a little figure, they had fixed the date of this awful inundation a whole century too early. The stars were right after all, and they, erring mortals, were wrong. The present generation of Cockneys was safe, and London would be washed away, not in 1524, but in 1624. At this announcement Bolton the prior dismantled his fortress, and the weary emigrants came back. An eye-witness of the Great Fire of London, in an account preserved among the Harleian manuscripts in the British Museum, and published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Antiquaries, relates another instance of the credulity of the Londoners. The writer, who accompanied the Duke of York day by day through the district included between the Fleet Bridge and the Thames, states that, in their efforts to check the progress of the flames, they were much impeded by the superstition of the people. Mother Shipton, in one of her prophecies, had said that London would be reduced to ashes, and they refused to make any effort to prevent it. Footnote: this prophecy seems to have been that set forth at length in the popular Life of Mother Shipton. When fate to England shall restore a king to reign as heretofore, great death in London shall be though, and many houses be laid low. End footnote. A son of the noted Sir Kenelm Digby, who was also a pretender to the gifts of prophecy, persuaded them that no power on earth could prevent the fulfilment of the prediction, for it was written in the great book of fate that London was to be destroyed. Hundreds of persons, who might have rendered valuable assistance and saved whole parishes from devastation, folded their arms and looked on. As many more gave themselves up, with the less compunction, to plunder a city which they could not save. Footnote: the London Saturday Journal of March 12, 1842, contains the following: an absurd report is gaining ground among the weak-minded that London will be destroyed by an earthquake on the 17th of March or St. Patrick's Day. This rumour is founded on the following ancient prophecies, one professing to be pronounced in the year 1203, the other by Dr. Dee, the astrologer, in 1598. Quote, in 1842 4 things the sun shall view: London's rich and famous town, hungry earth shall swallow down. Storm and rain in France shall be, till every river runs a sea. Spain shall be rent in twain, and famine waste the land again. So say I, the monk of Dree, in the 1200th year and 3. Harleian Collection, British Museum, 800b, folio 319. The Lord have mercy on you all, prepare yourselves for dreadful fall, of house and land and human soul, the measure of your sins is full. In the year 18 and 42, of the year that is so new, in the 3rd month of that 16, it may be a day or two between, perhaps you'll soon be stiff and cold. Dear Christian, be not stout and bold, the mighty, kingly proud will see, this comes to pass as my name's Dee. 1598, manuscript in the British Museum. The alarm of the population of London did not on this occasion extend beyond the wide circle of the uneducated classes, but among them it equalled that recorded in the text. It was soon afterwards stated that no such prophecy is to be found in the Harleian manuscripts. The prophecies of Mother Shipton are still believed in many of the rural districts of England. In cottages and servants' halls her reputation is great, and she rules, the most popular of British prophets, among all the uneducated or half-educated portions of the community. She is generally supposed to have been born at Knaresborough, in the reign of Henry VII, and to have sold her soul to the devil for the power of foretelling future events. Though during her lifetime she was looked upon as a witch, she yet escaped the witch's fate, and died peaceably in her bed at an extreme old age, near Clifton in Yorkshire. A stone is said to have been erected to her memory in the churchyard of that place, with the following epitaph: quoth, "Here lies she who never lied, whose skill often has been tried, her prophecies shall still survive, and ever keep her name alive." Never a day passed, says her traditionary biography, "wherein she did not relate something remarkable, and that required the most serious consideration. People flocked to her from far and near, her fame was so great. They went to her of all sorts, both old and young, rich and poor, especially young maidens, to be resolved of their doubts relating to things to come, and all returned wonderfully satisfied in the explanations she gave to their questions." Among the rest went the Abbot of Beverley, to whom she foretold the suppression of the monasteries by Henry VIII, his marriage with Anne Boleyn, the fires of heretics in Smithfield, and the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. She also foretold the accession of James I, adding that, with him, "from the cold north every evil should come forth." On a subsequent visit she uttered another prophecy, which, in the opinion of her believers, still remains unfulfilled, but may be expected to be realized during the present century. "The time shall come when seas of blood shall mingle with a greater flood. Great noise there shall be heard, great shouts and cries, and seas shall thunder louder than the skies. Then shall 3 lions fight with 3, and bring joy to a people, honor to a king. That fiery year as soon as over, peace shall then be as before, plenty shall everywhere be found, and men with swords shall plough the ground." But the most famous of all her prophecies is one relating to London. Thousands of persons still shudder to think of the woes that are to burst over this unhappy realm, when London and Highgate are joined by one continuous line of houses. This junction, which, if the rage for building lasts much longer, in the same proportion as heretofore, bids fair to be soon accomplished, was predicted by her shortly before her death. Revolutions, the fall of mighty monarchs, and the shedding of much blood are to signalize that event. The very angels, afflicted by our woes, are to turn aside their heads, and weep for hapless Britain. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. Modern Prophecies, Part 2. But great as is the fame of Mother Shipton, she ranks but second in the list of British prophets. Merlin, the mighty Merlin, stands alone in his high preeminence, the first and greatest. As old Drayton sings in his Polyolbion, quote, "Of Merlin and his skill what region doth not hear? The world shall still be full of Merlin every year. 1,000 lingering years his prophecies have run, and scarcely shall have end till time itself be done." End quote. Spenser, in his divine poem, has given us a powerful description of this renowned seer. Quote, "Who had in magic more insight than ever him before or after living wight. For he by words could call out of the sky both sun and moon, and make them him obey. The land to sea, and sea to mainland dry, and darksome night he eke could turn to day. Huge hosts of men he could alone dismay, and hosts of men and meanest things could frame, when so him list his enemies to fray, that to this day, for terror of his name, the fiends do quake when any him to them does name. And sooth men say that he was not the son of mortal sire or other living wight, but wondrously begotten and begone by false illusion of a guileful sprite on a fair lady nun." End quote. In these verses the poet has preserved the popular belief with regard to Merlin, who is generally supposed to have been a contemporary of Vortigern. Opinion is divided as to whether he were a real personage or a mere impersonation, formed by the poetic fancy of a credulous people. It seems most probable that such a man did exist, and that, possessing knowledge as much above the comprehension of his age as that possessed by Friar Bacon was beyond the reach of his, he was endowed by the wondering crowd with the supernatural attributes that Spenser has enumerated. Geoffrey of Monmouth translated Merlin's poetical odes, or prophecies, into Latin prose, and he was much reverenced not only by Geoffrey, but by most of the old annalists. In A Life of Merlin, with his prophecies and predictions interpreted and made good by our English annals, by Thomas Heywood, published in the reign of Charles I, we find several of these pretended prophecies. They seem, however, to have been all written by Heywood himself. They are in terms too plain and positive to allow any one to doubt for a moment of their having been composed ex post facto. Speaking of Richard I, he says, quote, "The lion's heart will 'gainst the Saracen rise, and purchase from him many a glorious prize. The rose and lily shall at first unite, but parting of the prey prove opposite. But while abroad these great acts shall be done, all things at home shall to disorder run. Cooped up and caged then shall the lion be, but after sufferance ransomed and set free." End quote. The simple-minded Thomas Heywood gravely goes on to inform us that all these things actually came to pass. Upon Richard III he is equally luminous. He says, quote, "A hunchbacked monster, who with teeth is born, the mockery of art and nature's scorn, who from the womb preposterously is hurled, and with the feet forward thrust into the world, shall, from the lower earth on which he stood, wade every step he mounts knee-deep in blood. He shall to the height of all his hopes aspire, and, clothed in state, his ugly shape admire. But when he thinks himself most safe to stand, from foreign parts a native whelp shall land." End quote. Another of these prophecies after the event tells us that Henry VIII should take the power from Rome, quote, "and bring it home unto his British bower," end quote. That he should, quote, "root out from the land all the razed skulls," end quote, and that he should neither spare, quote, "man in his rage nor woman in his lust," end quote, and that, in the time of his next successor but one, quote, "there should come in the faggot and the stake," end quote. Master Heywood closes Merlin's prophecies at his own day, and does not give even a glimpse of what was to befall England after his decease. Many other prophecies, besides those quoted by him, were, he says, dispersed abroad in his day under the name of Merlin, but he gives his readers a taste of one only, and that is the following. Quote, "When hemp is ripe and ready to pull, then, Englishman, beware thy skull." End quote. This prophecy, which, one would think, ought to have put him in mind of the gallows, at that time the not unusual fate of false prophets, he explains thus, quote, In this word hemp be 5 letters. Now, by reckoning the 5 successive princes from Henry VIII, this prophecy is easily explained. H signifieth King Henry before named. E. Edward his son, the 6th of that name. M. Mary, who succeeded him. P. Philip of Spain, who, by marrying Queen Mary, participated with her in the English diadem. And lastly, E. signifieth Queen Elizabeth, after whose death there was a great fear that some troubles might have arisen about the crown." As this did not happen, Heywood, who was a sly rogue in a small way, gets out of the scrape by saying, "Yet proved this augury true, though not according to the former expectation. For, after the peaceful inauguration of King James, there was a great mortality, not in London only, but through the whole kingdom, and from which the nation was not quite clean in 7 years after." This is not unlike the subterfuge of Peter of Pontefract, who had prophesied the death and disposition of King John, and who was hanged by that monarch for his pains. A very graphic and amusing account of this pretended prophet is given by Grafton, in his Chronicles of England. "In the meanwhile," says he, "the priests within England had provided them a false and counterfeited prophet, called Peter Wakefield, a Yorkshire man, who was an hermite, an idle gatter-about, and a prattling merchant. Now to bring this Peter in credit, and the king out of all credit with his people, divers vain persons brooded daily among the commons of the realm, that Christ had twice appeared unto him in the shape of a child between the priest's hands, once at York, another time at Pomfret, and that he had breathed upon him thrice, saying, Peace, 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 and teaching many things, which he anon declared to the bishops, and bid the people amend their naughty living. Being rapt also in spirit, they said he beheld the joys of heaven and sorrows of hell, for scant were there 3 in the realm, said he, that lived Christianly. This counterfeited soothsayer prophesied of King John that he should reign no longer than the Ascension Day next following, which was in the year of our Lord 1211, and was the 13th year from his coronation, and this, he said, he had by revelation. Then it was of him demanded whether he should be slain or be deposed, or should voluntarily give over the crown. He answered that he could not tell, but of this he was sure, he said, that neither he nor any of his stock or lineage should reign after that day. The king, hearing of this, laughed much at it, and made but a scoff thereat. Tush, saith he, 'tis but an idiot knave, and such a one as lacketh his right wits. But when this foolish prophet had so escaped the danger of the king's displeasure, and that he made no more of it, he gaed him abroad, and prated thereof at large, as he was a very idle vagabond, and used to tattle and talk more than enough. So that they which loved the king caused him anon after to be apprehended as a malefactor, and to be thrown in prison, the king not yet knowing thereof. Anon after the fame of this fantastical prophet went all the realm over, and his name was known everywhere, as foolishness is much regarded of the people, where wisdom is not in place, specially because he was then imprisoned for the matter, the rumour was the larger, their wanderings were the wantoner, their practices the foolisher, their busy talks and other idle doings the greater. Continually from thence, as the rude manner of people is, old gossip tales went abroad, new tales were invented, fables were added to fables, and lies grew upon lies, so that every day new slanders were laid upon the king, and not one of them true. Rumours arose, blasphemies were spread, the enemies rejoiced, and treasons by the priests were maintained, and what likewise was surmised, or other subtlety practised, all was then fathered upon this foolish prophet, as thus saith Peter Wakefield, thus hath he prophesied, and thus it shall come to pass. Yea, many times, when he thought nothing less. And when the Ascension Day was come, which was prophesied of before, King John commanded his royal tent to be spread in the open field, passing that day with his noble council and men of honour in the greatest solemnity that ever he did before, solacing himself with musical instruments and songs, most in sight among his trusty friends. When that day was passed in all prosperity and mirth, his enemies being confused, turned all into an allegorical understanding to make the prophecy good, and said, he is no longer king, for the Pope reigned, and not he. King John was labouring under a sentence of excommunication at that time. Then was the king by his council persuaded that this false prophet had troubled the realm, perverted the hearts of the people, and raised the commons against him, for his words went over the sea by the help of his prelates, and came to the French king's ear, and gave to him a great encouragement to invade the land. He had not else done it so suddenly. But he was most foully deceived, as all they are and shall be that put their trust in such dark drowsy dreams of hypocrites. The king therefore commanded that he should be hanged up, and his son also with him, lest any more false prophets should arise of that race." Heywood, who was a great stickler for the truth of all sorts of prophecies, gives a much more favourable account of this Peter of Pomfret or Pontefract, whose fate he would in all probability have shared if he had had the misfortune to have flourished in the same age. He says that Peter, who was not only a prophet but a bard, predicted divers of King John's disasters, which fell out accordingly. On being taxed for a lying prophet in having predicted that the king would be deposed before he entered into the 15th year of his reign, he answered him boldly that all he had said was justifiable and true, for that, having given up his crown to the Pope, and paying him an annual tribute, the Pope reigned, and not he. Heywood thought this explanation to be perfectly satisfactory, and the prophet's faith for ever established. But to return to Merlin. Of him even to this day it may be said, in the words which Burns has applied to another notorious personage, "Great was his power, and great his fame, far kenned and noted his name." His reputation is by no means confined to the land of his birth, but extends through most of the nations of Europe. A very curious volume of his Life, Prophecies, and Miracles, written, it is supposed, by Robert de Bosran, was printed at Paris in 1498, which states that the devil himself was his father, and that he spoke the instant he was born, and assured his mother, a very virtuous young woman, that she should not die in childbed with him, as her ill-natured neighbours had predicted. The judge of the district, hearing of so marvellous an occurrence, summoned both mother and child to appear before him, and they went accordingly the same day. To put the wisdom of the young prophet most effectually to the test, the judge asked him if he knew his own father. To which the infant Merlin replied, in a clear sonorous voice, "Yes, my father is the devil, and I have his power, and know all things, past, present, and to come." His worship clapped his hands in astonishment, and took the prudent resolution of not molesting so awful a child or its mother either. Early tradition attributes the building of Stonehenge to the power of Merlin. It was believed that those mighty stones were whirled through the air, at his command, from Ireland to Salisbury Plain, and that he arranged them in the form in which they now stand, to commemorate for ever the unhappy fate of 300 British chiefs who were massacred on that spot by the Saxons. At Abergwili, near Carmarthen, is still shown the cave of the prophet and the scene of his incantations. How beautiful is the description of it given by Spenser in his Faerie Queene! The lines need no apology for their repetition here, and any sketch of the great prophet of Britain would be incomplete without them. "There the wise Merlin whilom wont, they say, to make his wonn low underneath the ground, in a deep delve far from the view of day, that of no living wight he mot be found, whence so he counselled with his sprites encompassed round. And if thou ever happen that same way to travel, go to see that dreadful place. It is a hideous hollow cave, they say, under a rock that lies a little space from the swift Barry, tumbling down apace amongst the woody hills of Denver. But dare thou not, I charge, in any case, to enter into that same baleful bower, for fear the cruel fiends should thee unwares devour. But, standing high aloft, low lay thine ear, and there such ghastly noise of iron chains and brazen cauldrons thou shalt rumbling hear, which 1,000 sprites with long enduring pains do toss, that it will stun thy feeble brains. And oftentimes great groans and grievous stounds, when too huge toil and labour them constrains, and oftentimes loud strokes and ringing sounds, from under that deep rock most horribly rebounds. The cause, they say, is this: a little while before that Merlin died, he did intend a brazen wall in compass to compile about Caer Murden, and did it command unto these sprites to bring to perfect end, during which work the Lady of the Lake, whom long he loved, for him in haste did send, who thereby forced his workmen to forsake, them bound till his return their labour not to slake. In the meantime, through that false lady's train he was surprised and buried under bier,
no ever to his work returned again. Nevertheless these fiends may not their work forbear, so greatly his commandment they fear, but there do toil and travel day and night, until that brazen wall they up do rear." Fairy Queen, Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 6-13. Amongst other English prophets, a belief in whose power has not been entirely effaced by the light of advancing knowledge, is Robert Nixon, the Cheshire idiot, a contemporary of Mother Shipton. The popular accounts of this man say that he was born of poor parents not far from Vale Royal, on the edge of the forest of Delamere. He was brought up to the plough, but was so ignorant and stupid that nothing could be made of him. Everybody thought him irretrievably insane, and paid no attention to the strange, unconnected discourses which he held. Many of his prophecies are believed to have been lost in this manner. But they were not always destined to be wasted upon dull and inattentive ears. An incident occurred which brought him into notice, and established his fame as a prophet of the first calibre. He was ploughing in a field when he suddenly stopped from his labour, and with a wild look and strange gesture exclaimed, "Now, Dick! Now, Harry! Oh, ill done, Dick! Oh, well done, Harry! Harry was gained the day!" His fellow labourers in the field did not know what to make of this rhapsody, but the next day cleared up the mystery. News was brought by a messenger, in hot haste, that at the very instant when Nixon had thus ejaculated, Richard III had been slain at the battle of Bosworth, and Henry VII proclaimed King of England. It was not long before the fame of the new prophet reached the ears of the king, who expressed a wish to see and converse with him. A messenger was accordingly dispatched to bring him to court, but long before he reached Cheshire, Nixon knew and dreaded the honours that awaited him. Indeed, it was said that at the very instant the king expressed the wish, Nixon was, by supernatural means, made acquainted with it, and that he ran about the town of Over in great distress of mind, calling out, like a madman, that Henry had sent for him, and that he must go to court, and be clammed, that is, starved to death. These expressions excited no little wonder, but on the third day the messenger arrived, and carried him to court, leaving on the minds of the good people of Cheshire an impression that their prophet was one of the greatest ever born. On his arrival, King Henry appeared to be troubled exceedingly at the loss of a valuable diamond, and asked Nixon if he could inform him where it was to be found. Henry had hidden the diamond himself, with a view to test the prophet's skill. Great, therefore, was his surprise when Nixon answered him in the words of the old proverb, "Those who hide can find." From that time forth the king implicitly believed that he had the gift of prophecy, and ordered all his words to be taken down. During all the time of his residence at court he was in constant fear of being starved to death, and repeatedly told the king that such would be his fate if he were not allowed to depart and return into his own country. Henry would not suffer it, but gave strict orders to all his officers and cooks to give him as much to eat as he wanted. He lived so well that for some time he seemed to be thriving like a nobleman's steward, and growing as fat as an alderman. One day the king went out hunting, when Nixon ran to the palace gate and entreated on his knees that he might not be left behind to be starved. The king laughed, and, calling an officer, told him to take especial care of the prophet during his absence, and rode away to the forest. After his departure, the servants of the palace began to jeer at and insult Nixon, whom they imagined to be much better treated than he deserved. Nixon complained to the officer, who, to prevent him from being further molested, locked him up in the king's own closet, and brought him regularly his 4 meals a day. But it so happened that the messenger arrived from the king to this officer, requiring his immediate presence at Winchester on a matter of life and death. So great was his haste to obey the king's command that he mounted on the horse behind the messenger and rode off, without bestowing a thought upon poor Nixon. He did not return till 3 days afterwards, when, remembering the prophet for the first time, he went to the king's closet and found him lying upon the floor, starved to death, as he had predicted. Among the prophecies of his, which are believed to have been fulfilled, are the following, which relate to the times of the Pretender. Quote, "A great man shall come into England, but the son of a king shall take from him the victory." Quote, "Crowds shall drink the blood of many nobles, and the north shall rise against the south." Quote, "The cock of the north shall be made to flee, and his feather be plucked for his pride, that he shall almost curse the day that he was born." All these, say his admirers, are as clear as the sun at noonday. The first denotes the defeat of Prince Charles Edward at the Battle of Culloden by the Duke of Cumberland; the second the execution of Lords Derwentwater, Balmerino, and Lovat; and the third the retreat of the Pretender from the shores of Britain. Among the prophecies that still remain to be accomplished are the following: "Between 7, 8, and 9 in England wonders shall be seen; between 9 and 13 all sorrow shall be done." "Through our own money and our men shall a dreadful war begin; between the sickle and the suck all England shall have a pluck." "Foreign nations shall invade England with snow on their helmets, and shall bring plague, famine, and murder in the skirts of their garments." "The town of Nantwich shall be swept away by a flood." Of the two first of these no explanation has yet been attempted, but some event or other will doubtless be twisted into such a shape as will fit them. The third, relative to the invasion of England by a nation with snow on their helmets, is supposed by the old women to foretell most clearly a coming war with Russia. As to the last, there are not a few in the town mentioned who devoutly believe that such will be its fate. Happily for their peace of mind, the prophet said nothing of the year that was to witness the awful calamity, so that they think it as likely to be 2 centuries hence as now. The popular biographers of Nixon conclude their account of him by saying that "his prophecies are by some persons thought fables, yet by what has come to pass it is now thought, and very plainly appears, that most of them have proved or will prove true, for which we on all occasions ought not only to exert our utmost might to repel by force our enemies, but to refrain from our abandoned and wicked course of life, and to make our continual prayer to God for protection and safety." To this, though a non sequitur, every one will cry Amen. Besides the prophets, there have been the almanac makers Lilly, Poor Robin, Partridge, and Francis Moore physician, in England, and Matthew Landsberg, in France and Belgium. But great as were their pretensions, they were modesty itself in comparison with Merlin, Shipton, and Nixon, who fixed their minds upon higher things than the weather, and were not so restrained as to prophesy for only 1 year at a time. After such prophets the almanac makers hardly deserve to be mentioned; not even the renowned Partridge, whose prognostications set all England agog in 1708, and whose death while still alive was so pleasantly and satisfactorily proved by Isaac Bickerstaff. The anticlimax would be too palpable, and they and their doings must be left uncommemorated. End of Chapter 5, Part 2.
Chapter 6, Part 1 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Anne Cheng, London, England. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. Fortune Telling, Part 1. And men still grope t' anticipate the cabinet designs of fate, apply to wizards to foresee what shall and what shall never be. Hudibras, Part 3, Canto 3. In accordance with the plan laid down, we proceed to the consideration of the follies into which men have been led by their eager desire to pierce the thick darkness of futurity. God himself, for his own wise purposes, has more than once undrawn the impenetrable veil which shrouds those awful secrets, and, for purposes just as wise, he has decreed that except in these instances ignorance shall be our lot for ever. It is happy for man that he does not know what the morrow is to bring forth, but, unaware of this great blessing, he has, in all ages of the world, presumptuously endeavoured to trace the events of unborn centuries, and anticipate the march of time. He has reduced this presumption into a study. He has divided it into sciences and systems without number, employing his whole life in the vain pursuit. Upon no subject has it been so easy to deceive the world as upon this. In every breast the curiosity exists in a greater or less degree, and can only be conquered by a long course of self-examination, and a firm reliance that the future would not be hidden from our sight, if it were right that we should be acquainted with it. An undue opinion of our own importance in the scale of creation is at the bottom of all our unwarrantable notions in this respect. How flattering to the pride of man to think that the stars in their courses watch over him, and typify by their movements and aspects the joys or the sorrows that await him! He, less in proportion to the universe than the all but invisible insects that feed in myriads on a summer's leaf are to this great globe itself, fondly imagines that eternal worlds were chiefly created to prognosticate his fate. How we should pity the arrogance of the worm that crawls at our feet, if we knew that it also desired to know the secrets of futurity, and imagined that meteors shot athwart the sky to warn it that a tom tit was hovering near to gobble it up, that storms and earthquakes, the revolutions of empires, or the fall of mighty monarchs, only happened to predict its birth, its progress, and its decay. Not a whit less presuming has man shown himself. Not a whit less arrogant are the sciences, so called, of astrology, augury, necromancy, geomancy, palmistry, and divination of every kind. Leaving out of view the oracles of pagan antiquity and religious predictions in general, and confining ourselves solely to the persons who in modern times have made themselves most conspicuous in foretelling the future, we shall find that the 16th and 17th centuries were the golden age of these impostors. Many of them have already been mentioned in their character of alchemists. The union of the two pretensions is not at all surprising. It was to be expected that those who assumed a power so preposterous as that of prolonging the life of man for several centuries should pretend at the same time to foretell the events which were to mark that preternatural span of existence. The world would as readily believe that they had discovered all secrets as that they had only discovered one. The most celebrated astrologers of Europe 3 centuries ago were alchemists. Agrippa, Paracelsus, Dr. Dee, and the Rosicrucians all laid as much stress upon their knowledge of the days to come as upon their pretended possession of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. In their time, ideas of the wonderful, the diabolical, and the supernatural were rifer than ever they were before. The devil or the stars were universally believed to meddle constantly in the affairs of men, and both were to be consulted with proper ceremonies. Those who were of a melancholy and gloomy temperament betook themselves to necromancy and sorcery. Those more cheerful and aspiring devoted themselves to astrology. The latter science was encouraged by all the monarchs and governments of that age. In England, from the time of Elizabeth to that of William and Mary, judicial astrology was in high repute. During that period flourished Doctors Dee, Lamb, and Forman, with Lilly, Booker, Gadbury, Evans, and scores of nameless impostors in every considerable town and village in the country, who made it their business to cast nativities, aid in the recovery of stolen goods, prognosticate happy or unhappy marriages, predict whether journeys would be prosperous, and denote lucky moments for the commencement of any enterprise, from the setting up of a cobbler's shop to the marching of an army. Men who, to use the words of Butler, did deal in destiny's dark counsel, and sage opinion of the moon sell, to whom all people far and near on deep importance did repair, when brass and pewter pots did stray, and linen slunk out of the way. In Lilly's Memoirs of his life and times there are many notices of the inferior quacks who then abounded, and upon whom he pretended to look down with supreme contempt, not because they were astrologers, but because they debased that noble art by taking fees for the recovery of stolen property. From Butler's Hudibras and its curious notes, we may learn what immense numbers of these fellows lived upon the credulity of mankind in that age of witchcraft and diablerie. Even in our day, how great is the reputation enjoyed by the almanac makers, who assume the name of Francis Moore! But in the time of Charles I and the Commonwealth, the most learned, the most noble, and the most conspicuous characters did not hesitate to consult astrologers in the most open manner. Lilly, whom Butler has immortalised under the name of Sidrafel, relates that he proposed to write a work called an introduction to astrology, in which he would satisfy the whole kingdom of the lawfulness of that art. Many of the soldiers were for it, he says, and many of the independent party, and abundance of worthy men in the House of Commons, his assured friends, and able to take his part against the Presbyterians, who would have silenced his predictions if they could. He afterwards carried his plan into execution, and when his book was published, went with another astrologer named Booker to the headquarters of the Parliamentary army at Windsor, where they were welcomed and feasted in the garden where General Fairfax lodged. They were afterwards introduced to the General, who received them very kindly, and made allusion to some of their predictions. He hoped their art was lawful and agreeable to God's word, but he did not understand it himself. He did not doubt, however, that the two astrologers feared God, and therefore he had a good opinion of them. Lilly assured him that the art of astrology was quite consonant to the Scriptures, and confidently predicted from his knowledge of the stars that the Parliamentary army would overthrow all its enemies. In Oliver's Protectorate, this quack informs us that he wrote freely enough. He became an independent, and all the soldiery were his friends. When he went to Scotland, he saw a soldier standing in front of the army with a book of prophecies in his hand, exclaiming to the several companies as they passed by him, "Lo, hear what Lilly saith, you are in this month promised victory. Fight it out, brave boys, and then read that month's prediction." After the great fire of London, which Lilly said he had foretold, he was sent for by the Committee of the House of Commons, appointed to inquire into the causes of the calamity. In his Monarchy or No Monarchy, published in 1651, he had inserted an hieroglyphical plate representing on one side persons in winding sheets digging graves, and on the other a large city in flames. After the great fire, some sapient member of the legislature bethought him of Lilly's book, and having mentioned it in the House, it was agreed that the astrologer should be summoned. Lilly attended accordingly, when Sir Robert Brooke told him the reason of his summons and called upon him to declare what he knew. This was a rare opportunity for the vain-glorious Lilly to vaunt his abilities, and he began a long speech in praise of himself and his pretended science. He said that after the execution of Charles I, he was extremely desirous to know what might from that time forth happen to the Parliament, and to the nation in general. He therefore consulted the stars, and satisfied himself. The result of his judgment he put into emblems and hieroglyphics, without any commentary, so that the true meaning might be concealed from the vulgar, and made manifest only to the wise, imitating in this the example of many wise philosophers who had done the like. "Did you foresee the year of the fire?" said a member. "No," quoth Lilly, "nor was I desirous. Of that I made no scrutiny." After some further parley, the House found they could make nothing of the astrologer, and dismissed him with great civility. One specimen of the explanation of a prophecy given by Lilly, and related by him with much complacency, will be sufficient to show the sort of trash by which he imposed upon the million. In the year 1588, says he, there was a prophecy printed in Greek characters, exactly deciphering the long troubles of the English nation from 1641 to 1660, and it ended thus: "And after him shall come a dreadful dead man, and with him a royal G, of the best blood in the world, and he shall have the crown, and shall set England on the right way, and put out all heresies." The following is the explanation of this oracular absurdity. Monkery being extinguished above 80 or 90 years, and the Lord General's name being Monk, is a dead man. The royal G or C, it is gamma in the Greek, intending C in the Latin, being the third letter in the alphabet, is Charles II, who for his extraction may be said to be of the best blood of the world. In France and Germany astrologers met even more encouragement than they received in England. In very early ages, Charlemagne and his successors fulminated their wrath against them in common with sorcerers. Louis XI, that most superstitious of men, entertained great numbers of them at his court, and Catherine de Medicis, that most superstitious of women, hardly ever undertook any affair of importance without consulting them. She chiefly favoured her own countrymen, and during the time she governed France, the land was overrun by Italian conjurers, necromancers, and fortune-tellers of every kind. But the chief astrologer of that day, beyond all doubt, was the celebrated Nostradamus, physician to her husband, King Henry II. He was born in 1503 at the town of St. Remy in Provence, where his father was a notary. He did not acquire much fame till he was past his 50th year, when his famous Centuries, a collection of verses written in obscure and almost unintelligible language, began to excite attention. They were so much spoken of in 1556 that Henry II resolved to attach so skilful a man to his service, and appointed him his physician. In a biographical notice of him prefixed to the edition of his Vrije Centuries, published at Amsterdam in 1668, we are informed that he often discoursed with his royal master on the secrets of futurity, and received many great presents as his reward, besides his usual allowance for medical attendance. After the death of Henry, he retired to his native place, where Charles IX paid him a visit in 1564, and was so impressed with veneration for his wondrous knowledge of the things that were to be, not in France only, but in the whole world for hundreds of years to come, that he made him a counsellor of state and his own physician, besides treating him in other matters with a royal liberality. In fine, continues his biographer, I should be too prolix were I to tell all the honours conferred upon him, and all the great nobles and learned men that arrived at his house from the very ends of the earth, to see and converse with him as if he had been an oracle. Many strangers, in fact, came to France for no other purpose than to consult him. The prophecies of Nostradamus consist of upwards of 1,000 stanzas, each of 4 lines, and are to the full as obscure as the oracles of old. They take so great a latitude, both as to time and space, that they are almost sure to be fulfilled somewhere or other in the course of a few centuries. A little ingenuity, like that evinced by Lilly in his explanation about General Monk and the dreadful dead man, might easily make events to fit some of them. 58. Let us try. In his 2nd century, prediction 66, he says, "From great dangers the captive is escaped. A little time, great fortune changed. In the palace the people are caught. By good augury the city is besieged." What is this, a believer might exclaim, but the escape of Napoleon from Elba, his changed fortune, and the occupation of Paris by the allied armies? Let us try again. In his 3rd century, prediction 98, he says, "Two royal brothers will make fierce war on each other. So mortal shall be the strife between them, that each one shall occupy a fort against the other, for their reign and life shall be the quarrel." Some Linnaeus Redivivus would find no difficulty in this prediction. To use a vulgar phrase, it is as clear as a pikestaff. Had not the astrologer in view Don Miguel and Don Pedro when he penned this stanza, so much less obscure and oracular than the rest? He is to this day extremely popular in France and the Walloon country of Belgium, where old farmer wives consult him with great confidence and assiduity. Catherine de Medicis was not the only member of her illustrious house who entertained astrologers. At the beginning of the 15th century there was a man named Basil residing in Florence who was noted over all Italy for his skill in piercing the darkness of futurity. It is said that he foretold to Cosmo de Medicis, then a private citizen, that he would attain high dignity, inasmuch as the ascendant of his nativity was adorned with the same propitious aspects as those of Augustus Caesar and the Emperor Charles V. Another astrologer foretold the death of Prince Alexander de Medicis, and so very minute and particular was he in all the circumstances, that he was suspected of being chiefly instrumental in fulfilling his own prophecy, a very common resource with these fellows to keep up their credit. He foretold confidently that the prince should die by the hand of his own familiar friend, a person of a slender habit of body, a small face, a swarthy complexion, and of most remarkable taciturnity. So it afterwards happened, Alexander having been murdered in his chamber by his cousin Lorenzo, who corresponded exactly with the above description. The author of Hermippus Redivivus, in relating this story, inclines to the belief that the astrologer was guiltless of any participation in the crime, but was employed by some friend of Prince Alexander to warn him of his danger. A much more remarkable story is told of an astrologer who lived in Romagna in the 15th century, and whose name was Antiochus Tibertus. Note 61. At that time, nearly all the petty sovereigns of Italy retained such men in their service, and Tibertus, having studied the mathematics with great success at Paris, and delivered many predictions, some of which for guesses were not deficient in shrewdness, was taken into the household of Pandolfo di Malatesta, the sovereign of Rimini. His reputation was so great that his study was continually thronged, either with visitors who were persons of distinction, or with clients who came to him for advice, and in a short time he acquired a considerable fortune. Notwithstanding all these advantages, he passed his life miserably, and ended it on the scaffold. The following story afterwards got into circulation, and has been often triumphantly cited by succeeding astrologers as an irrefragable proof of the truth of their science. It was said that long before he died he uttered 3 remarkable prophecies, one relating to himself, another to his friend, and the third to his patron, Pandolfo di Malatesta. The first delivered was that relating to his friend Guido di Bogni, one of the greatest captains of the time. Guido was exceedingly desirous to know his fortune, and so importuned Tibertus that the latter consulted the stars and the lines on his palm to satisfy him. He afterwards told him with a sorrowful face that according to all the rules of astrology and palmistry he should be falsely suspected by his best friend, and should lose his life in consequence. Guido then asked the astrologer if he could foretell his own fate, upon which Tibertus again consulted the stars, and found that it was decreed from all eternity that he should end his days on the scaffold. Malatesta, when he heard these predictions, so unlikely to all present appearance to prove true, desired his astrologer to predict his fate also, and to hide nothing from him, however unfavourable it might be. Tibertus complied, and told his patron, at that time one of the most flourishing and powerful princes of Italy, that he should suffer great want and die at last like a beggar in the common hospital of Bologna. And so it happened in all 3 cases. Guido di Bogni was accused by his own father-in-law, the Count di Bentivoglio, of a treasonable design to deliver up the city of Rimini to the papal forces, and was assassinated afterwards by order of the tyrant Malatesta, as he sat at the supper-table to which he had been invited in all apparent friendship. The astrologer was at the same time thrown into prison as being concerned in the treason of his friend. He attempted to escape, and had succeeded in letting himself down from his dungeon window into a moat when he was discovered by the sentinels. This being reported to Malatesta, he gave orders for his execution on the following morning. Malatesta had at this time no remembrance of the prophecy, and his own fate gave him no uneasiness, but events were silently working its fulfilment. A conspiracy had been formed, though Guido di Bogni was innocent of it, to deliver up Rimini to the Pope, and all the necessary measures having been taken, the city was seized by the Count de Valentinois. In the confusion, Malatesta had barely time to escape from his palace in disguise. He was pursued from place to place by his enemies, abandoned by all his former friends, and finally by his own children. He at last fell ill of a languishing disease at Bologna, and, nobody caring to afford him shelter, he was carried to the hospital, where he died. The only thing that detracts from the interest of this remarkable story is the fact that the prophecy was made after the event. For some weeks before the birth of Louis XIV, an astrologer from Germany who had been sent for by the Marshal de Bassompierre and other noblemen of the court had taken up his residence in the palace, to be ready at a moment's notice to draw the horoscope of the future sovereign of France. When the Queen was taken in labour, he was ushered into a contiguous apartment, that he might receive notice of the very instant the child was born. The result of his observations were the 3 words, Dieu dure félicité, meaning that the new-born prince should live and reign long, with much labour and with great glory. No prediction less favourable could have been expected from an astrologer, who had his bread to get, and who was at the same time a courtier. A medal was afterwards struck in commemoration of the event, upon one side of which was figured the nativity of the prince, representing him as driving the chariot of Apollo, with the inscription Ortus Solis Gallici, the rising of the Gallic sun. The best excuse ever made for astrology was that offered by the great astronomer Kepler, himself an unwilling practiser of the art. He had many applications from his friends to cast nativities for them, and generally gave a positive refusal to such as he was not afraid of offending by his frankness. In other cases he accommodated himself to the prevailing delusion. In sending a copy of his Ephemerides to Professor Gerlach, he wrote that they were nothing but worthless conjectures, but he was obliged to devote himself to them, or he would have starved. "Ye overwise philosophers," he exclaimed in his Tertius Interveniens, "ye censure this daughter of astronomy beyond her deserts. Know ye not that she must support her mother by her charms? The scanty reward of an astronomer would not provide him with bread, if men did not entertain hopes of reading the future in the heavens." Necromancy was, next to astrology, the pretended science most resorted to by those who wished to pry into the future. The earliest instance upon record is that of the witch of Endor and the spirit of Samuel. Nearly all the nations of antiquity believed in the possibility of summoning departed ghosts to disclose the awful secrets that God made clear to the disembodied. Many passages in allusion to this subject will at once suggest themselves to the classical reader, but this art was never carried on openly in any country. All governments looked upon it as a crime of the deepest dye. While astrology was encouraged and its professors courted and rewarded, necromancers were universally condemned to the stake or the gallows. Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, Arnold of Villeneuve, and many others were accused by the public opinion of many centuries of meddling in these unhallowed matters. So deep-rooted has always been the popular delusion with respect to accusations of this kind, that no crime was ever disproved with such toil and difficulty. That it met great encouragement, nevertheless, is evident from the vast numbers of pretenders to it, who, in spite of the danger, have existed in all ages and countries. Geomancy, or the art of foretelling the future by means of lines and circles and other mathematical figures drawn on the earth, is still extensively practised in Asiatic countries, but is almost unknown in Europe. Augury from the flight or entrails of birds, so favourite a study among the Romans, is in like manner exploded in Europe. Its most assiduous professors at the present day are the abominable thugs of India. Divination, of which there are many kinds, boasts a more enduring reputation. It has held an empire over the minds of men from the earliest periods of recorded history, and is, in all probability, coeval with time itself. It was practised alike by the Jews, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, is equally known to all modern nations in every part of the world, and is not unfamiliar to the untutored tribes that roam in the wilds of Africa and America. Divination, as practised in civilized Europe at the present day, is chiefly from cards, the teacup, and the lines on the palm of the hand. Gipsies alone make a profession of it, but there are thousands and tens of thousands of humble families in which the good wife, and even the good man, resort to the grounds at the bottom of their teacups to know whether the next harvest will be abundant, or their sow bring forth a numerous litter, and in which the young maidens look to the same place to know when they are to be married, and whether the man of their choice is to be dark or fair, rich or poor, kind or cruel. Divination by cards, so great a favourite among the moderns, is, of course, a modern science, as cards do not yet boast an antiquity of much more than 400 years. Divination by the palm, so confidently believed in by half the village lasses in Europe, is of older date, and seems to have been known to the Egyptians in the time of the patriarchs, as well as divination by the cup, which, as we are informed in Genesis, was practised by Joseph. Divination by the rod was also practised by the Egyptians. In comparatively recent times it was pretended that by this means hidden treasures could be discovered. it now appears to be altogether exploded in Europe. Onomancy, or the foretelling of a man's fate by the letters of his name, and the various transpositions of which they are capable, is a more modern sort of divination, but it reckons comparatively few believers. The following list of the various species of divination formerly in use is given by Gall in his Megastromancer and quoted in Hone's Yearbook, page 1517. Stereomancy, or divining by the elements. Aeromancy, or divining by the air. Pyromancy, by fire. Hydromancy, by water. Geomancy, by earth. Theomancy, pretending to divine by the revelation of the Spirit and by the Scriptures or Word of God. Demonomancy, by the aid of devils and evil spirits. Idolomancy, by idols, images, and figures. Psychomancy, by the soul, affections, or dispositions of men. Anthropomancy, by the entrails of human beings. Theriomancy, by beasts. Ornithomancy, by birds. Ichthyomancy, by fishes. Botanomancy, by herbs. Lithomancy, by stones. Kleromancy, by lots. Oniromancy, by dreams. Onomancy, by names. Arithmancy, by numbers. Logarithmancy, by logarithms. Sternomancy, by the marks from the breast to the belly. Gastromancy, by the sound of or marks upon the belly. Omphalomancy, by the navel. Chiromancy, by the hands. Podomancy, by the feet. Onchyomancy, by the nails. Kephaleonomancy, by asses' heads. Tephromancy, by ashes. Capnomancy, by smoke. Knissomancy, by the burning of incense. Cheromancy, by the melting of wax. Lecanomancy, by basins of water. Catoptromancy, by looking glasses. Cartomancy, by writing in papers and by valentines. Macaromancy, by knives and swords. Crystallomancy, by crystals. Dactylomancy, by rings. Koskinomancy, by sieves. Axinomancy, by saws. Calmancy, by vessels of brass or other metal. Spatillomancy, by skins, bones, etc. Astromancy, by stars. Sciomancy, by shadows. Astragalomancy, by dice. Oinomancy, by the lees of wine. Sycomancy, by figs. Tyromancy, by cheese. Alphitomancy, by meal, flour, or bran. Crithomancy, by corn or grain. Electromancy, by cocks. Gyromancy, by circles. Lampadomancy, by candles and lamps. End of chapter 6, part 1. Chapter 6, Part 2 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. Fortune-telling, Part 2. Onirocriticism, or the art of interpreting dreams, is a relic of the most remote ages, which has subsisted through all the changes that moral or physical revolutions have operated in the world. The records of 5,000 years bear abundant testimony to the universal diffusion of the belief that the skilful could read the future in dreams. The rules of the art, if any existed in ancient times, are not known. But in our day, one simple rule opens the whole secret. Dreams, say all the wiseacres in Christendom, are to be interpreted by contraries. Thus, if you dream of filth, you will acquire something valuable. If you dream of the dead, you will hear news of the living. If you dream of gold and silver, you run a risk of being without either. And if you dream you have many friends, you will be persecuted by many enemies. The rule, however, does not hold good in all cases. It is fortunate to dream of little pigs, but unfortunate to dream of big bullocks. If you dream you have lost a tooth, you may be sure that you will shortly lose a friend. And if you dream that your house is on fire, you will receive news from a far country. If you dream of vermin, it is a sign that there will be sickness in your family. And if you dream of serpents, you will have friends who in the course of time will prove your bitterest enemies. But of all dreams it is most fortunate if you dream that you are wallowing up to your neck in mud and mire. Clear water is a sign of grief, and great troubles, distress, and perplexity are predicted if you dream that you stand naked in the public streets, and know not where to find a garment to shield you from the gaze of the multitude. In many parts of Great Britain and the continents of Europe and America, there are to be found elderly women in the villages and country places, whose interpretations of dreams are looked upon with as much reverence as if they were oracles. In districts remote from towns, it is not uncommon to find the members of a family regularly every morning narrating their dreams at the breakfast table, and becoming happy or miserable for the day according to their interpretation. There is not a flower that blossoms or fruit that ripens that dreamed of is not ominous of either good or evil to such people. Every tree of the field or the forest is endowed with a similar influence over the fate of mortals, if seen in the night visions. To dream of the ash is the sign of a long journey, and of an oak prognosticates long life and prosperity. To dream you strip the bark off any tree is a sign to a maiden of an approaching loss of character, to a married woman of a family bereavement, and to a man of an accession of fortune. To dream of a leafless tree is a sign of great sorrow, and of a branchless trunk a sign of despair and suicide. The elder tree is more auspicious to the sleeper, while the fir tree, better still, betokens all manner of comfort and prosperity. The lime tree predicts a voyage across the ocean, while the yew and the alder are ominous of sickness to the young and of death to the old. It is quite astonishing to see the great demand there is, both in England and France, for dream books and other trash of the same kind. 2 books in England enjoy an extraordinary popularity, and have run through upwards of 50 editions in as many years in London alone, besides being reprinted in Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dublin. One is Mother Bridget's Dream Book and Oracle of Fate. The other is the Norwood Gipsy. It is stated on the authority of one who is curious in these matters that there is a demand for these works, which are sold at sums varying from a penny to 6pence, chiefly to servant girls and imperfectly educated people all over the country, of upwards of 11,000 annually, and that at no period during the last 30 years has the average number sold been less than this. The total number during this period would thus amount to 330,000. Among the flowers and fruits charged with messages of the future, the following is a list of the most important, arranged from approved sources in alphabetical order. Asparagus, gathered and tied up in bundles, is an omen of tears. If you see it growing in your dreams, it is a sign of good fortune. Aloes without a flower betokens long life. In flower betokens a legacy. Artichokes. This vegetable is a sign that you will receive in a short time a favour from the hands of those from whom you would least expect it. Agrimony. This herb denotes that there will be sickness in your house. Anemone predicts love. Auriculars in beds denote luck, in pots marriage, while to gather them foretells widowhood. Bilberries predict a pleasant excursion. Broom flowers an increase of family. Cauliflowers predict that all your friends will slight you, or that you will fall into poverty and find no one to pity you. Dock leaves a present from the country. Daffodils. Any maiden who dreams of daffodils is warned by her good angel to avoid going into a wood with her lover, or into any dark or retired place where she might not be able to make people hear her if she cried out. Alas for her if she pay no attention to the warning. Never again shall she put garland on. Instead of it she'll wear sad cypress now, and bitter elder broken from the bough. Figs, if green, betoken embarrassment; if dried, money to the poor and mirth to the rich. Heart's ease betokens heart's pain. Lilies predict joy. Water lilies danger from the sea. Lemons betoken a separation. Pomegranates predict happy wedlock to those who are single, and reconciliation to those who are married and have disagreed. Quinces prognosticate pleasant company. Roses denote happy love, not unmixed with sorrow from other sources. Sorrel, to dream of this herb is a sign that you will shortly have occasion to exert all your prudence to overcome some great calamity. Sunflowers show that your pride will be deeply wounded. Violets predict evil to the single, and joy to the married. Yellow flowers of any kind predict jealousy. Yewberries predict loss of character to both sexes. It should be observed that the rules for the interpretation of dreams are far from being universal. The cheeks of the peasant girl of England glow with pleasure in the morning after she has dreamed of a rose, while the paysanne of Normandy dreads disappointment and vexation for the very same reason. The Switzer who dreams of an oak tree does not share in the Englishman's joy, for he imagines that the vision was a warning to him that from some trifling cause an overwhelming calamity will burst over him. Thus do the ignorant and the credulous torment themselves, thus do they spread their nets to catch vexation, and pass their lives between hopes which are of no value and fears which are positive evil. Omens. Among the other means of self-annoyance upon which men have stumbled in their vain hope of discovering the future, signs and omens hold a conspicuous place. There is scarcely an occurrence in nature which, happening at a certain time, is not looked upon by some persons as a prognosticator either of good or evil. The latter are in the greatest number, so much more ingenious are we in tormenting ourselves than in discovering reasons for enjoyment in the things that surround us. We go out of our course to make ourselves uncomfortable. The cup of life is not bitter enough to our palate, and we distill superfluous poison to put into it, or conjure up hideous things to frighten ourselves at, which would never exist if we did not make them. We suffer, says Addison, as much from trifling accidents as from real evils. I have known the shooting of a star spoil a night's rest, and have seen a man in love grow pale and lose his appetite upon the plucking of a merry-thought. A screech owl at midnight has alarmed a family more than a band of robbers. Nay, the voice of a cricket has struck more terror than the roaring of a lion. There is nothing so inconsiderable which may not appear dreadful to an imagination that is filled with omens and prognostics. A rusty nail or a crooked pin shoot up into prodigies. The century and a quarter that has passed away since Addison wrote has seen the fall of many errors. Many fallacies and delusions have been crushed under the foot of time since then, but this has been left unscathed to frighten the weak-minded and embitter their existence. A belief in omens is not confined to the humble and uninformed. A general who led an army with credit has been known to feel alarmed at a winding sheet in the candle, and learned men who had honourably and fairly earned the highest honours of literature have been seen to gather their little ones around them, and fear that one would be snatched away, because, when stole upon the time the dead of night, and heavy sleep had closed up mortal eyes, a dog in the street was howling at the moon. Persons who would acknowledge freely that the belief in omens was unworthy of a man of sense have yet confessed at the same time that, in spite of their reason, they have been unable to conquer their fears of death when they heard the harmless insect called the death watch ticking in the wall, or saw an oblong hollow coal fly out of the fire. Many other evil omens besides those mentioned above alarm the vulgar and the weak. If a sudden shivering comes over such people, they believe that at that instant an enemy is treading over the spot that will one day be their grave. If they meet a sow when they first walk abroad in the morning, it is an omen of evil for that day. To meet an ass is in like manner unlucky. It is also very unfortunate to walk under a ladder, to forget to eat goose on the festival of St. Michael, to tread upon a beetle, or to eat the twin nuts that are sometimes found in one shell. Woe, in like manner, is predicted to that wight who inadvertently upsets the salt. Each grain that is overthrown will bring to him a day of sorrow. If 13 persons sit at table, one of them will die within the year, and all of them will be unhappy. Of all evil omens, this is the worst. The facetious Dr. Kitchener used to observe that there was one case in which he believed that it was really unlucky for 13 persons to sit down to dinner, and that was when there was only dinner enough for 12. Unfortunately for their peace of mind, the great majority of people do not take this wise view of the matter. In almost every country of Europe the same superstition prevails, and some carry it so far as to look upon the number 13 as in every way ominous of evil, and if they find 13 coins in their purse, cast away the odd one like a polluted thing. The philosophic Béranger, in his exquisite song 13 at Table, has taken a poetical view of this humiliating superstition, and mingled, as is his wont, a lesson of genuine wisdom in his lay. Being at dinner, he overthrows the salt, and, looking round the room, discovers that he is the 13th guest. While he is mourning his unhappy fate, and conjuring up visions of disease and suffering and the grave, he is suddenly startled by the apparition of Death herself, not in the shape of a grim foe, with skeleton ribs and menacing dart, but of an angel of light, who shows the folly of tormenting ourselves with the dread of her approach, when she is the friend rather than the enemy of man, and frees us from the fetters which bind us to the dust. If men could bring themselves to look upon death in this manner, living well and wisely till her inevitable approach, how vast a store of grief and vexation would they spare themselves! Among good omens, one of the most conspicuous is to meet a piebald horse. To meet 2 of these animals is still more fortunate, and if on such an occasion you spit thrice, and form any reasonable wish, it will be gratified within 3 days. It is also a sign of good fortune if you inadvertently put on your stocking wrong side out. If you wilfully wear your stocking in this fashion, no good will come of it. It is very lucky to sneeze twice, but if you sneeze a 3rd time, the omen loses its power, and your good fortune will be nipped in the bud. If a strange dog follow you and fawn on you, and wish to attach itself to you, it is a sign of very great prosperity. Just as fortunate is it if a strange male cat comes to your house, and manifests friendly intentions towards your family. If a she-cat, it is an omen, on the contrary, of very great misfortune. If a swarm of bees alight in your garden, some very high honour and great joys await you. Besides these glimpses of the future, you may know something of your fate by a diligent attention to every itching that you may feel in your body. Thus, if the eye or the nose itches, it is a sign you will be shortly vexed. If the foot itches, you will tread upon strange ground, and if the elbow itches, you will change your bedfellow. Itching of the right hand prognosticates that you will soon have a sum of money, and of the left that you will be called upon to disperse it. These are but a few of the omens which are generally credited in modern Europe. A complete list of them would fatigue from its length and sicken from its absurdity. It would be still more unprofitable to attempt to specify the various delusions of the same kind which are believed among Oriental nations. Every reader will remember the comprehensive formula of cursing preserved in Tristram Shandy. Curse a man after any fashion you remember or can invent, you will be sure to find it there. The Oriental creed of omens is not less comprehensive. Every movement of the body, every emotion of the mind, is at certain times an omen. Every form and object in nature, even the shape of the clouds and the changes of the weather, every colour, every sound, whether of men or animals, or birds or insects, or inanimate things, is an omen. Nothing is too trifling or inconsiderable to inspire hope which is not worth cherishing, or fear which is sufficient to embitter existence. From the belief in omens springs a superstition that has from very early ages set apart certain days as more favourable than others for prying into the secrets of futurity. The following, copied verbatim from the popular Dream and Omen book of Mother Bridget, will show the belief of the people of England at the present day. Those who are curious as to the ancient history of these observances will find abundant aliment in the Everyday book. The 1st of January. If a young maiden drink, on going to bed, a pint of cold spring water, in which is beat up an amulet composed of the yolk of a pullet's egg, the legs of a spider, and the skin of an eel pounded, her future destiny will be revealed to her in a dream. This charm fails of its effect if tried any other day of the year. Valentine Day. Let a single woman go out of her own door very early in the morning, and if the first person she meets be a woman, she will not be married that year. If she meet a man, she will be married within 3 months. Lady Day. The following charm may be tried this day with certain success. String 31 nuts on a string composed of red worsted mixed with blue silk, and tie it round your neck on going to bed, repeating these lines: oh, I wish to see who my true love is to be. Shortly after midnight you will see your lover in a dream, and be informed at the same time of all the principal events of your future life. St. Swithin's Eve. Select 3 things you most wish to know. Write them down with a new pen and red ink on a sheet of fine wove paper, from which you must previously cut off all the corners and burn them. Fold the paper into a true lover's knot, and wrap round it 3 hairs from your head. Place the paper under your pillow for 3 successive nights, and your curiosity to know the future will be satisfied. St. Mark's Eve. Repair to the nearest churchyard as the clock strikes 12, and take from a grave on the south side of the church 3 tufts of grass. The longer and ranker the better, and on going to bed place them under your pillow, repeating earnestly 3 several times, the eve of St. Mark by prediction is blessed. Set therefore my hopes and my fears all to rest. Let me know my fate, whether weal or woe, whether my ranks to be high or low, whether to live single or be a bride, and the destiny my star doth provide. Should you have no dream that night, you will be single and miserable all your life. If you dream of thunder and lightning, your life will be one of great difficulty and sorrow. Candlemas Eve. On this night, which is the purification of the Virgin Mary, let 3, 5, 7, or 9 young maidens assemble together in a square chamber. Hang in each corner a bundle of sweet herbs mixed with rue and rosemary. Then mix a cake of flour, olive oil, and white sugar, every maiden having an equal share in the making and the expense of it. Afterwards it must be cut into equal pieces, each one marking the piece as she cuts it with the initials of her name. It is then to be baked 1 hour before the fire, not a word being spoken the whole time, and the maidens sitting with their arms and knees across. Each piece of cake is then to be wrapped up in a sheet of paper, on which each maiden shall write the love part of Solomon's songs. If she put this under her pillow, she will dream true. She will see her future husband and every one of her children, and will know besides whether her family will be poor or prosperous, a comfort to her or the contrary. Midsummer. Take 3 roses, smoke them with sulphur, and exactly at 3 in the day bury one of the roses under a yew tree, the second in a newly made grave, and put the third under your pillow for 3 nights, and at the end of that period burn it in a fire of charcoal. Your dreams during that time will be prophetic of your future destiny, and what is still more curious and valuable, says Mother Bridget, the man whom you are to wed will enjoy no peace till he comes and visits you. Besides this, you will perpetually haunt his dreams. St. John's Eve. Make a new pin-cushion of the very best black velvet. No inferior quality will answer the purpose. And on one side stick your name at full length with the very smallest pins that can be bought. None other will do. On the other side make a cross with some very large pins, and surround it with a circle. Put this into your stocking when you take it off at night, and hang it up at the foot of your bed. All your future life will pass before you in a dream. First new moon of the year. On the first new moon in the year, take a pint of clear spring water, and infuse into it the white of an egg laid by a white hen, a glass of white wine, 3 almonds peeled white, and a tablespoonful of white rose water. Drink this on going to bed, not making more nor less than 3 draughts of it, repeating the following verses 3 several times in a clear distinct voice, but not so loud as to be overheard by anybody. If I dream of water pure before the coming morn, 'tis a sign I shall be poor, and unto wealth not born. If I dream of tasting beer, middling then will be my cheer, checkered with the good and bad, sometimes joyful, sometimes sad. But should I dream of drinking wine, wealth and pleasure will be mine. The stronger the drink, the better the cheer. Dreams of my destiny appear, appear. 29th of February. This day, as it only occurs once in 4 years, is peculiarly auspicious to those who desire to have a glance at futurity, especially to young maidens burning with anxiety to know the appearance and complexion of their future lords. The charm to be adopted is the following. Stick 27 of the smallest pins that are made, 3 by 3, into a tallow candle. Light it up at the wrong end, and then place it in a candlestick made out of clay, which must be drawn from a virgin's grave. Place this on the chimney place and in the left-hand corner exactly as the clock strikes 12, and go to bed immediately. When the candle is burnt out, take the pins and put them into your left shoe, and before 9 nights have elapsed, your fate will be revealed to you. We have now taken a hasty review of the various modes of seeking to discover the future, especially as practised in modern times. The main features of the folly appear essentially the same in all countries. National character and peculiarities operate some difference of interpretation. The mountaineer makes the natural phenomena which he most frequently witnesses prognosticative of the future. The dweller in the plains, in a similar manner, seeks to know his fate among the signs of the things that surround him, and tints his superstition with the hues of his own clime. The same spirit animates them all, the same desire to know that which infinite mercy has concealed. There is but little probability that the curiosity of mankind in this respect will ever be wholly eradicated. Death and ill fortune are continual bugbears to the weak-minded, the irreligious and the ignorant, and while such exist in the world, divines will preach upon its impiety, and philosophers discourse upon its absurdity in vain. Still it is evident that these follies have greatly diminished. Soothsayers and prophets have lost the credit they formerly enjoyed, and skulk in secret now where they once showed their faces in the blaze of day. So far there is manifest improvement. End of Chapter 6, Part 2.
Chapter 7, Part 1 of Memoir of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoir of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. The Magnetisers, Part 1. Some deemed them wondrous wise, and some believed them mad. Beattie's Minstrel. The wonderful influence of imagination in the cure of diseases is well known. A motion of the hand, or a glance of the eye, will throw a weak and credulous patient into a fit, and a pill made of bread, if taken with sufficient faith, will operate a cure better than all the drugs in the pharmacopoeia. The Prince of Orange, at the siege of Breda in 1625, cured all his soldiers who were dying of the scurvy by a philanthropic piece of quackery, which he played upon them with the knowledge of the physicians, when all other means had failed. Note 64. See Van der Mey's account of the siege of Breda. The garrison being afflicted with scurvy, the Prince of Orange sent the physicians 2 or 3 small phials containing a decoction of chamomile, wormwood, and camphor, telling them to pretend that it was a medicine of the greatest value and extremest rarity, which had been procured with very much danger and difficulty from the East, and so strong that 2 or 3 drops would impart a healing virtue to a gallon of water. The soldiers had faith in their commander. They took the medicine with cheerful faces, and grew well rapidly. They afterwards thronged about the prince in groups of 20 and 30 at a time, praising his skill, and loading him with protestations of gratitude. Many hundreds of instances of a similar kind might be related, especially from the history of witchcraft. The mummeries, strange gesticulations, and barbarous jargon of witches and sorcerers, which frightened credulous and nervous women, brought on all those symptoms of hysteria and other similar diseases, so well understood now, but which were then supposed to be the work of the devil, not only by victims and the public in general, but by the operators themselves.
In the age when alchemy began to fall into some disrepute, and learning to lift up its voice against it, a new delusion, based upon this power of imagination, suddenly arose, and found apostles among all the alchemists. Numbers of them, forsaking their old pursuits, made themselves Magnetisers. It appeared first in the shape of mineral, and afterwards of animal magnetism, under which latter name it survives to this day, and numbers its dupes by thousands. The mineral magnetisers claim the first notice, as the worthy predecessors of the quacks of the present day. The honour claimed for Paracelsus of being the first of the Rosicrucians has been disputed, but his claim to be considered the first of the magnetisers can scarcely be challenged. It has been already mentioned of him, in the part of this work which treats of alchemy, that, like nearly all the distinguished adepts, he was a physician, and pretended not only to make gold and confer immortality, but to cure all diseases. He was the first who, with the latter view, attributed occult and miraculous powers to the magnet. Animated apparently by a sincere conviction that the magnet was the philosopher's stone, which, if it could not transmute metals, could soothe all human suffering and arrest the progress of decay, he travelled for many years in Persia and Arabia in search of the mountain of adamant so famed in Oriental fables. When he practised as a physician at Basel, he called one of his nostrums by the name of Azoth, a stone or crystal, which, he said, contained magnetic properties, and cured epilepsy, hysteria, and spasmodic affections. He soon found imitators, his fame spread far and near, and thus were sown the first seeds of that error which has since taken root and flourished so widely. In spite of the denial of modern practitioners, this must be considered the origin of magnetism, for we find that beginning with Paracelsus, there was a regular succession of mineral magnetisers until Mesmer appeared and gave a new feature to the delusion. Paracelsus boasted of being able to transplant diseases from the human frame into the earth by means of the magnet. He said there were 6 ways by which this might be effected. One of them will be quite sufficient as a specimen. If a person suffer from disease, either local or general, let the following remedy be tried. Take a magnet, impregnate it with mummy, note 65. Mummies were of several kinds, and were all of great use in magnetic medicines. Paracelsus enumerates 6 kinds of mummies. The first 4, only differing in the composition used by different people for preserving their dead, are the Egyptian, Arabian, Pisisphaltos, and Libyan. The 5th mummy of peculiar power was made from criminals that had been hanged. For from such there is a gentle psycation that expungeth the watery humour, without destroying the oil and spiritual, which is cherished by the heavenly luminaries, and strengthened continually by the affluence and impulses of the celestial spirits, whence it may be properly called by the name of constellated or celestial mummy. The 6th kind of mummy was made of corpuscles, or spiritual effluences, radiated from the living body, though we cannot get very clear idea on this head, or respecting the manner in which they were caught. Medicina dietastica, or sympathetical mummy, abstracted from the works of Paracelsus, and translated out of the Latin by Fernando Parkhurst, gentleman, London, 1653, pages 2 and 7, quoted by the Foreign Quarterly Review, volume 12, page 415. Take a magnet impregnated with mummy and mixed with rich earth. In this earth sow some seeds that have a congruity or homogeneity with the disease. Then let this earth, well sifted and mixed with mummy, be laid in an earthen vessel, and let the seeds committed to it be watered daily with a lotion in which the diseased limb or body has been washed. Thus will the disease be transplanted from the human body to the seeds which are in the earth. Having done this, transplant the seeds from the earthen vessel to the ground, and wait till they begin to sprout into herbs. As they increase, the disease will diminish, and when they have arrived at their full growth, it will disappear altogether. Kircher the Jesuit, whose quarrel with the alchemists was the means of exposing many of their impostures, was a firm believer in the efficacy of the magnet. Having been applied to by a patient afflicted with hernia, he directed the man to swallow a small magnet reduced to powder, while he applied at the same time to the external swelling a poultice made of filings of iron. He expected that by this means the magnet, when it got to the corresponding place inside, would draw in the iron, and with it the tumour, which would thus, he said, be safely and expeditiously reduced. As this new doctrine of magnetism spread, it was found that wounds inflicted with any metallic substance could be cured by the magnet. In process of time, the delusion so increased that it was deemed sufficient to magnetize a sword to cure any hurt which that sword might have inflicted. This was the origin of the celebrated weapon salve, which excited so much attention about the middle of the 17th century. The following was the recipe given by Paracelsus for the cure of any wounds inflicted by a sharp weapon, except such as had penetrated the heart, the brain, or the arteries. Take of moss growing on the head of a thief who has been hanged and left in the air, of real mummy, of human blood still warm, of each 1 ounce, of human suet 2 ounces, of linseed oil, turpentine, and Armenian bole, of each 2 drachms. Mix all well in a mortar, and keep the salve in an oblong narrow urn. With this salve the weapon, after being dipped in the blood from the wound, was to be carefully anointed, and then laid by in a cool place. In the meantime, the wound was to be duly washed with fair clean water, covered with a clean soft linen rag, and opened once a day to cleanse off purulent or other matter. Of the success of this treatment, says the writer of the able article on animal magnetism in the 12th volume of the Foreign Quarterly Review, there cannot be the least doubt, for surgeons at this moment follow exactly the same method, except anointing the weapon. The weapon salve continued to be much spoken of on the continent, and many eager claimants appeared for the honour of the invention. Dr. Flood, or A. Fluctibus, the Rosicrucian, who has been already mentioned in a previous part of this volume, was very zealous in introducing it into England. He tried it with great success in several cases, and no wonder, for while he kept up the spirits of his patients by boasting of the great efficacy of the salve, he never neglected those common but much more important remedies of washing, bandaging, etc., which the experience of all ages had declared sufficient for the purpose. Flood moreover declared that the magnet was a remedy for all diseases if properly applied, but that man, having like the earth a north and a south pole, magnetism could only take place when his body was in a boreal position. In the midst of his popularity, an attack was made upon him and his favourite remedy, the salve, which, however, did little or nothing to diminish the belief in its efficacy. One Parson Foster wrote a pamphlet, entitled Hyplocrisma Spongus, or A Sponge to Wipe Away the Weapon Salve, in which he declared that it was as bad as witchcraft to use or recommend such an unguent, that it was invented by the devil, who at the last day would seize upon every person who had given it the slightest encouragement. In fact, said Parson Foster, the devil himself gave it to Paracelsus, Paracelsus to the emperor to the courtier, and the courtier to Baptista Porta, and Baptista Porta to Dr. Flood, a doctor of physic, yet living and practising in the famous city of London, who now stands tooth and nail for it. Dr. Flood, thus assailed, took up the pen in defence of his unguent in a reply called The Squeezing of Parson Foster's Sponge, wherein the sponge-bearer's immodest carriage and behaviour towards his brethren is detected. The bitter flames of his slanderous reports are, by the shop vinegar of truth, corrected and quite extinguished. And lastly, the virtuous validity of his sponge in wiping away the weapon salve is crushed out and clean abolished. Shortly after this dispute, a more distinguished believer in the weapon salve made his appearance in the person of Sir Kenelm Digby, son of Sir Everard Digby, who was executed for his participation in the gunpowder plot. This gentleman, who, in other respects, was an accomplished scholar and an able man, was imbued with all the extravagant notions of the alchemists. He believed in the philosopher's stone, and wished to engage Descartes to devote his energies to the discovery of the elixir of life, or some other means by which the existence of man might be prolonged to an indefinite period. He gave his wife, the beautiful Venetia Anastasia Stanley, a dish of capons fed upon vipers, according to the plan supposed to have been laid down by Arnold of Villeneuve, in the hope that she might thereby preserve her loveliness for a century. If such a man once took up the idea of the weapon salve, it was to be expected that he would make the most of it. In his hands, however, it was changed from an unguent into a powder, and was called the powder of sympathy. He pretended that he had acquired the knowledge of it from a Carmelite friar, who had learned it in Persia or Armenia, from an Oriental philosopher of great renown. King James, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Buckingham, and many other noble personages believed in its efficacy. The following remarkable instance of his mode of cure was read by Sir Kenelm to a society of learned men at Montpellier. Mr. James Howell, the well-known author of the Dendrologia and of various letters, coming by chance as two of his best friends were fighting a duel, rushed between them and endeavoured to part them. He seized the sword of one of the combatants by the hilt, while at the same time he grasped the other by the blade. Being transported with fury one against the other, they struggled to rid themselves of the hindrance caused by their friend, and in so doing, the one whose sword was held by the blade by Mr. Howell drew it away roughly, and nearly cut his hand off, severing the nerves and muscles and penetrating to the bone. The other, almost at the same instant, disengaged his sword and aimed a blow at the head of his antagonist, which Mr. Howell, observing, raised his wounded hand with the rapidity of thought to prevent the blow. The sword fell on the back of his already wounded hand, and cut it severely. It seemed, said Sir Kenelm Digby, as if some unlucky star raged over them, that they should have both shed the blood of that dear friend for whose life they would have given their own, if they had been in their proper mind at the time. Seeing Mr. Howell's face all besmeared with blood from his wounded hand, they both threw down their swords and embraced him, and bound up his hand with a garter to close the veins which were cut and bled profusely. They then conveyed him home and sent for a surgeon. King James, who was much attached to Mr. Howell, afterwards sent his own surgeon to attend him. We must continue the narrative in the words of Sir Kenelm Digby. "It was my chance," says he, "to be lodged hard by him, and 4 or 5 days after, as I was making myself ready, he came to my house and prayed me to view his wounds. For I understand," said he, "that you have extraordinary remedies on such occasions, and my surgeons apprehend some fear that it may grow to a gangrene, and so the hand must be cut off." In effect his countenance discovered that he was in much pain, which, he said, was insupportable in regard of the extreme inflammation. I told him I would willingly serve him, but if haply he knew the manner how I could cure him, without touching or seeing him, it might be that he would not expose himself to my manner of curing, because he would think it, peradventure, either ineffectual or superstitious. He replied, "The many wonderful things which people have related unto me of your way of medicinement makes me nothing doubt at all of its efficacy, and all that I have to say unto you is comprehended in the Spanish proverb, Hágase el milagro y hágalo Mahoma. Let the miracle be done, though Mahomet do it." I asked him then for any thing that had the blood upon it. So he presently sent for his garter, wherewith his hand was first bound. And as I called for a basin of water, as if I would wash my hands, I took a handful of powder of vitriol, which I had in my study, and presently dissolved it. As soon as the bloody garter was brought me, I put it in the basin, observing in the interim what Mr. Howell did, who stood talking with the gentleman in a corner of my chamber, not regarding at all what I was doing. He started suddenly, as if he had found some strange alteration in himself. I asked him what he ailed. "I know not what ails me, but I find that I feel no more pain. Methinks that a pleasing kind of freshness, as it were a wet cold napkin, did spread over my hand, which hath taken away the inflammation that tormented me before." I replied, "Since then you feel already so much good of my medicament, I advise you to cast away all your plasters. Only keep the wound clean, and in moderate temper betwixt heat and cold." This was presently reported to the Duke of Buckingham, and a little after to the King, who were both very curious to know the circumstances of the business; which was, that after dinner I took the garter out of the water, and put it to dry before a great fire. It was scarce dry before Mr. Howell's servant came running, and saying that his master felt as much burning as ever he had done, if not more, for the heat was such as if his hand were betwixt coals of fire. I answered that, although that had happened at present, yet he should find ease in a short time, for I knew the reason of this new accident, and would provide accordingly, for his master should be free from that inflammation, it might be before he could possibly return to him. But, in case he found no ease, I wished him to come presently back again. If not, he might forbear coming. Thereupon he went, and at the instant I did put the garter again into the water. Thereupon he found his master without any pain at all. To be brief, there was no sense of pain afterwards. But within 5 or 6 days the wounds were cicatrized and entirely healed. Such is the marvellous story of Sir Kenelm Digby. Other practitioners of that age were not behind him in their pretensions. It was not always thought necessary to use either the powder of sympathy or the weapon salve to effect a cure. It was sufficient to magnetize the sword with the hand, the first faint dawn of the animal theory, to relieve any pain the same weapon had caused. They asserted that if they stroked the sword upwards with their fingertips, the wounded person would feel immediate relief, but if they stroked it downwards, he would feel intolerable pain. Another very singular notion of the power and capabilities of magnetism was entertained at the same time. It was believed that a sympathetic alphabet could be made on the flesh, by means of which persons could correspond with each other and communicate all their ideas with the rapidity of volition, although thousands of miles apart. From the arms of two persons a piece of flesh was cut, and mutually transplanted while still warm and bleeding. The piece so severed grew to the new arm on which it was placed, but still retained so close a sympathy with its native limb that its old possessor was always sensible of any injury done to it. Upon these transplanted pieces were tattooed the letters of the alphabet, so that when a communication was to be made, either of the persons, though the wide Atlantic rolled between them, had only to prick his arm with a magnetic needle, and straightway his friend received intimation that the telegraph was at work. Whatever letter he pricked on his own arm pained the same letter on the arm of his correspondent. Contemporary with Sir Kenelm Digby was the no less famous Mr. Valentine Greatraks, who, without mentioning magnetism or laying claim to any theory, practised upon himself and others a deception much more akin to the animal magnetism of the present day than the mineral magnetism it was then so much the fashion to study. He was the son of an Irish gentleman, of good education and property, in the county of Cork. He fell at an early age into a sort of melancholy derangement. After some time he had an impulse, or strange persuasion in his mind, which continued to present itself, whether he were sleeping or waking, that God had given him the power of curing the king's evil. He mentioned this persuasion to his wife, who very candidly told him that he was a fool. He was not quite sure of this, notwithstanding the high authority from which it came, and determined to make trial of the power that was in him. A few days afterwards he went to one William Maire, of Saltersbridge, in the parish of Lismore, who was grievously afflicted with the king's evil in his eyes, cheek, and throat. Upon this man, who was of abundant faith, he laid his hands, stroked him, and prayed fervently. He had the satisfaction to see him heal considerably in the course of a few days, and finally, with the aid of other remedies, to be quite cured. This success encouraged him in the belief that he had a divine mission. Day after day he had further impulses from on high, that he was called upon to cure the ague also. In the course of time he extended his powers to the curing of epilepsy, ulcers, aches, and lameness. All the county of Cork was in a commotion to see this extraordinary physician, who certainly operated some very great benefit in cases where the disease was heightened by hypochondria and depression of spirits. According to his own account, such great multitudes resorted to him from divers places, that he had no time to follow his own business, or enjoy the company of his family and friends. He was obliged to set aside 3 days in the week, from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, during which time only he laid hands upon all that came. Still the crowds which thronged around him were so great, that the neighbouring towns were not able to accommodate them. He thereupon left his house in the country, and went to Youghal, where the resort of sick people, not only from all parts of Ireland, but from England, continued so great, that the magistrates were afraid they would infect the place by their diseases. Several of these poor credulous people no sooner saw him than they fell into fits, and he restored them by waving his hand in their faces, and praying over them. Nay, he affirmed that the touch of his glove had driven pains away, and on one occasion cast out from a woman several devils, or evil spirits, who tormented her day and night. Every one of these devils, says Greatraks, was like to choke her when it came up into her throat. It is evident from this that the woman's complaint was nothing but hysteria. The clergy of the diocese of Lismore, who seem to have had much clearer notions of Greatraks' pretensions than their parishioners, set their faces against the new prophet and worker of miracles. He was cited to appear in the Dean's court, and prohibited from laying on his hands for the future. But he cared nothing for the church. He imagined that he derived his powers direct from heaven, and continued to throw people into fits, and bring them to their senses again, as usual, almost exactly after the fashion of modern magnetisers. His reputation became at last so great that Lord Conway sent to him from London, begging that he would come over immediately to cure a grievous headache which his lady had suffered for several years, and which the principal physicians of England had been unable to relieve. Greatraks accepted the invitation, and tried his manipulations and prayers upon Lady Conway. He failed, however, in affording any relief. The poor lady's headache was excited by causes too serious to allow her any help, even from faith and a lively imagination. He lived for some months in Lord Conway's house at Ragley in Warwickshire, operating cures similar to those he had performed in Ireland. He afterwards removed to London, and took a house in Lincoln's Inn Fields, which soon became the daily resort of all the nervous and credulous women of the metropolis. A very amusing account of Greatraks at this time, 1665, is given in the second volume of the Miscellanies of St. Evremond, under the title of the Irish Prophet. It is the most graphic sketch ever made of this early magnetizer. Whether his pretensions were more or less absurd than those of some of his successors, who have lately made their appearance among us, would be hard to say. When Monsieur de Comminges, says St. Evremond, was ambassador from his most Christian Majesty to the King of Great Britain, there came to London an Irish prophet, who passed himself off as a great worker of miracles. Some persons of quality having begged Monsieur de Comminges to invite him to his house, that they might be witnesses of some of his miracles, the ambassador promised to satisfy them, as much to gratify his own curiosity as from courtesy to his friends, and gave notice to Greatraks that he would be glad to see him. A rumour of the prophet's coming soon spread all over the town, and the hotel of Monsieur de Comminges was crowded by sick persons, who came full of confidence in their speedy cure. The Irishman made them wait a considerable time for him, but came at last, in the midst of their impatience, with a grave and simple countenance that showed no signs of his being a cheat. Monsieur de Comminges prepared to question him strictly, hoping to discourse with him on the matters that he had read of in Van Helmont and Bodinus. But he was not able to do so, much to his regret, for the crowd became so great, and cripples and others pressed around so impatiently to be the first cured, that the servants were obliged to use threats and even force before they could establish order among them or place them in proper ranks. The prophet affirmed that all diseases were caused by evil spirits. Every infirmity was with him a case of diabolical possession. The first that was presented to him was a man suffering from gout and rheumatism, and so severely that the physicians had been unable to cure him. "Ah," said the miracle worker, "I have seen a good deal of this sort of spirits when I was in Ireland. They are watery spirits, who bring on cold shivering, and excite an overflow of aqueous humours in our poor bodies." Then, addressing the man, he said, "Evil spirit, who hast quitted thy dwelling in the waters to come and afflict this miserable body, I command thee to quit thy new abode, and to return to thine ancient habitation." This said, the sick man was ordered to withdraw, and another was brought forward in his place. This newcomer said he was tormented by the melancholy vapours. In fact, he looked like a hypochondriac, one of those persons diseased in imagination, and who but too often become so in reality. "Aerial spirit," said the Irishman, "return, I command thee, into the air. Exercise thy natural vocation of raising tempests, and do not excite any more wind in this sad, unlucky body." This man was immediately turned away to make room for a third patient, who, in the Irishman's opinion, was only tormented by a little bit of a sprite, who could not withstand his command for an instant. He pretended that he recognized the sprite by some marks which were invisible to the company, to whom he turned with a smile, and said, "This sort of spirit does not often do much harm, and is always very diverting." To hear him talk, one would have imagined that he knew all about spirits, their names, their rank, their numbers, their employment, and all the functions they were destined to. And he boasted of being much better acquainted with the intrigues of demons than he was with the affairs of men. You can hardly imagine what a reputation he gained in a short time. Catholics and Protestants visited him from every part, all believing that power from heaven was in his hands. After relating a rather equivocal adventure of a husband and wife who implored Greatraks to cast out the devil of dissension which had crept in between them, St. Evremond thus sums up the effect he produced on the popular mind. "So great was the confidence in him, that the blind fancied they saw the light which they did not see, the deaf imagined that they heard, the lame that they walked straight, and the paralytic that they had recovered the use of their limbs. An idea of health made the sick forget for a while their maladies, and imagination, which was not less active in those merely drawn by curiosity than in the sick, gave a false view to the one class, from the desire of seeing, as it operated a false cure on the other from the strong desire of being healed." Such was the power of the Irishman over the mind, and such was the influence of the mind upon the body. Nothing was spoken of in London but his prodigies, and these prodigies were supported by such great authorities that the bewildered multitude believed them almost without examination, while more enlightened people did not dare to reject them from their own knowledge. The public opinion, timid and enslaved, respected this imperious and apparently well authenticated error. Those who saw through the delusion kept their opinion to themselves, knowing how useless it was to declare their disbelief to a people filled with prejudice and admiration. About the same time that Valentine Greatraks was thus magnetizing the people of London, an Italian enthusiast, named Francisco Bagnone, was performing the same tricks in Italy, and with as great success. He had only to touch weak women with his hands, or sometimes, for the sake of working more effectively upon their fanaticism, with a relic, to make them fall into fits and manifest all the symptoms of magnetism. End of chapter 7, part 1.
Chapter 7, Part 2, of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. The Magnetisers, Part 2. Besides these, several learned men in different parts of Europe directed their attention to the study of the magnet, believing that it might be rendered efficacious in many diseases. Van Helmont, in particular, published a work on the effects of magnetism on the human frame, and Balthazar Gratian, a Spaniard, rendered himself famous for the boldness of his views on the subject. "The magnet," said the latter, "attracts iron. Iron is found everywhere. Everything, therefore, is under the influence of magnetism. It is only a modification of the general principle which establishes harmony or foments divisions among men. It is the same agent that gives rise to sympathy, antipathy, and the passions." Baptista Porter, who, in the whimsical genealogy of the weapon salve given by Parson Foster in his attack upon Dr. A. Fluctibus, is mentioned as one of its fathers, had also great faith in the efficacy of the magnet, and operated upon the imagination of his patients in a manner which was then considered so extraordinary that he was accused of being a magician, and prohibited from practising by the court of Rome. Among others who distinguished themselves by their faith in magnetism, Sebastian Virdig and William Maxwell claim especial notice. Virdig was professor of medicine at the University of Rostock in Mecklenburg, and wrote a treatise called The New Medicine of the Spirits, which he presented to the Royal Society of London. An edition of this work was printed in 1673, in which the author maintained that a magnetic influence took place not only between the celestial and terrestrial bodies, but between all living things. The whole world, he said, was under the influence of magnetism. Life was preserved by magnetism. Death was the consequence of magnetism. Maxwell, the other enthusiast, was an admiring disciple of Paracelsus, and boasted that he had irradiated the obscurity in which too many of the wonder-working recipes of that great philosopher were enveloped. His works were printed at Frankfurt in 1679. It would seem, from the following passage, that he was aware of the great influence of imagination, as well in the production as in the cure of diseases. "If you wish to work prodigies," says he, "abstract from the materiality of beings, increase the sum of spirituality in bodies, rouse the spirit from its slumbers. Unless you do one or other of these things, unless you combine the idea, you can never perform anything good or great." Here, in fact, lies the whole secret of magnetism, and all delusions of a similar kind. Increase the spirituality, rouse the spirit from its slumbers, or, in other words, work upon the imagination, induce belief and blind confidence, and you may do anything. This passage, which is quoted with approbation by M. Dupotet in a work, as strongly corroborative of the theory now advanced by the animal magnetists, is just the reverse. If they believe they can work all their wonders by the means so dimly shadowed forth by Maxwell, what becomes of the universal fluid pervading all nature, and which they pretend to pour into weak and diseased bodies from the tips of their fingers? Early in the 18th century, the attention of Europe was directed to a very remarkable instance of fanaticism, which has been claimed by the animal magnetists as a proof of their science. The convulsionaries of Saint Medard, as they were called, assembled in great numbers round the tomb of their favourite saint, the Jansenist priest Paris, and taught one another how to fall into convulsions. They believed that Saint Paris would cure all their infirmities, and the number of hysterical women and weak-minded persons of all descriptions that flocked to the tomb from far and near was so great as daily to block up all the avenues leading to it. Working themselves up to a pitch of excitement, they went off one after the other into fits, while some of them, still in apparent possession of all their faculties, voluntarily exposed themselves to sufferings which on ordinary occasions would have been sufficient to deprive them of life. The scenes that occurred were a scandal to civilization and to religion, a strange mixture of obscenity, absurdity, and superstition. While some were praying on bended knees at the shrine of St. Paris, others were shrieking and making the most hideous noises. The women especially exerted themselves. On one side of the chapel there might be seen a score of them, all in convulsions, while at another as many more, excited to a sort of frenzy, yielded themselves up to gross indecencies. Some of them took an insane delight in being beaten and trampled upon. One in particular, according to Montaigne, whose account we quote, was so enraptured with this ill usage that nothing but the hardest blows would satisfy her. While a fellow of Herculean strength was beating her with all his might with a heavy bar of iron, she kept continually urging him to renewed exertion. The harder he struck, the better she liked it, exclaiming all the while, "Well done, brother, well done! Oh, how pleasant it is! What good you are doing me! Courage, my brother, courage! Strike harder still!" Another of these fanatics had, if possible, a still greater love for a beating. Carré de Montgeron, who relates the circumstance, was unable to satisfy her with 60 blows of a large sledge-hammer. He afterwards used the same weapon, with the same degree of strength, for the sake of experiment, and succeeded in battering a hole in a stone wall at the 25th stroke. Another woman, named Sonnet, laid herself down on a red-hot brazier without flinching, and acquired for herself the nickname of the Salamander, while others, desirous of a more illustrious martyrdom, attempted to crucify themselves. M. Deleuze, in his critical history of animal magnetism, attempts to prove that this fanatical frenzy was produced by magnetism, and that these mad enthusiasts magnetized each other without being aware of it. As well might he insist that the fanaticism which tempts the Hindu bigot to keep his arms stretched in a horizontal position till the sinews wither, or his fingers closed upon his palms till the nails grow out of the backs of his hands, is also an effect of magnetism. For a period of 60 or 70 years, magnetism was almost wholly confined to Germany. Men of sense and learning devoted their attention to the properties of the lodestone, and one Father Hell, a Jesuit, and professor of astronomy at the University of Vienna, rendered himself famous by his magnetic cures. About the year 1771 or 1772, he invented steel plates of a peculiar form, which he applied to the naked body as a cure for several diseases. In the year 1774, he communicated his system to Anthony Mesmer. The latter improved upon the ideas of Father Hell, constructed a new theory of his own, and became the founder of animal magnetism. It has been the fashion among the enemies of the new delusion to decry Mesmer as an unprincipled adventurer, while his disciples have extolled him to the skies as a regenerator of the human race. In nearly the same words as the Rosicrucians applied to their founders, he has been called the discoverer of the secret which brings man into more intimate connection with his Creator, the deliverer of the soul from the debasing trammels of the flesh, the man who enables us to set time at defiance and conquer the obstructions of space. A careful sifting of his pretensions, and examination of the evidence brought forward to sustain them, will soon show which opinion is the more correct. That the writer of these pages considers him in the light of a man who, deluding himself, was the means of deluding others, may be inferred from his finding a place in these volumes, and figuring among the Flamels, the Agrippas, the Borries, the Burmans, and the Cagliostros. He was born in May 1734, at Mersburg, in Swabia, and studied medicine at the University of Vienna. He took his degrees in 1766 and chose the influence of the planets on the human body as the subject of his inaugural dissertation. Having treated the matter quite in the style of the old astrological physicians, he was exposed to some ridicule both then and afterwards. Even at this early period, some faint ideas of his great theory were germinating in his mind. He maintained in his dissertation that the sun, moon, and fixed stars mutually affect each other in their orbits, that they cause and direct in our earth a flux and reflux not only in the sea but in the atmosphere, and affect in a similar manner all organized bodies through the medium of a subtle and mobile fluid, which pervades the universe and associates all things together in mutual intercourse and harmony. This influence, he said, was particularly exercised on the nervous system, and produced two states which he called intention and remission, which seemed to him to account for the different periodical revolutions observable in several maladies. When in after life he met with Father Hell, he was confirmed by that person's observations in the truth of many of his own ideas. Having caused Hell to make him some magnetic plates, he determined to try experiments with them himself for his further satisfaction. He tried accordingly, and was astonished at his success. The faith of their wearers operated wonders with the metallic plates. Mesmer made due reports to Father Hell of all he had done, and the latter published them as the results of his own happy invention, and speaking of Mesmer as a physician whom he had employed to work under him. Mesmer took offence at being thus treated, considering himself a far greater personage than Father Hell. He claimed the invention as his own, accused Hell of a breach of confidence, and stigmatized him as a mean person, anxious to turn the discoveries of others to his own account. Hell replied, and a very pretty quarrel was the result, which afforded small talk for months to the literati of Vienna. Hell ultimately gained the victory. Mesmer, nothing daunted, continued to promulgate his views till he stumbled at last upon the animal theory. One of his patients was a young lady named Ersteline, who suffered under a convulsive malady. Her attacks were periodical and attended by a rush of blood to the head, followed by delirium and syncope. These symptoms he soon succeeded in reducing under his system of planetary influence, and imagined he could foretell the periods of accession and remission. Having thus accounted satisfactorily to himself for the origin of the disease, the idea struck him that he could operate a certain cure if he could ascertain beyond doubt what he had long believed, that there existed between the bodies which compose our globe an action equally reciprocal and similar to that of the heavenly bodies, by means of which he could imitate artificially the periodical revolutions of the flux and reflux before mentioned. He soon convinced himself that this action did exist. When trying the metallic plates of Father Hell, he thought their efficacy depended on their form, but he found afterwards that he could produce the same effects without using them at all, merely by passing his hands downwards towards the feet of the patient, even when at a considerable distance. This completed the theory of Mesmer. He wrote an account of his discovery to all the learned societies of Europe, soliciting their investigation. The Academy of Sciences at Berlin was the only one that answered him, and their answer was anything but favourable to his system, or flattering to himself. Still he was not discouraged. He maintained to all who would listen to him that the magnetic matter, or fluid, pervaded all the universe, that every human body contained it, and could communicate the superabundance of it to another by an exertion of the will. Writing to a friend from Vienna, he said, "I have observed that the magnetic is almost the same thing as the electric fluid, and that it may be propagated in the same manner by means of intermediate bodies. Steel is not the only substance adapted to this purpose. I have rendered paper, bread, wool, silk, stones, leather, glass, wood, men and dogs, in short, everything I touched, magnetic to such a degree that these substances produced the same effects as the lodestone on diseased persons. I have charged jars with magnetic matter in the same way as is done with electricity." Mesmer did not long find his residence at Vienna as agreeable as he wished. His pretensions were looked upon with contempt or indifference, and the case of Mademoiselle Esterline brought him less fame than notoriety. He determined to change his sphere of action, and travelled into Swabia and Switzerland. In the latter country he met with the celebrated Father Gassner, who, like Valentine Greatrax, amused himself by casting out devils, and healing the sick by merely laying hands upon them. At his approach, delicate girls fell into convulsions, and hypochondriacs fancied themselves cured. His house was daily besieged by the lame, the blind, and the hysteric. Mesmer at once acknowledged the efficacy of his cures, and declared that they were the obvious result of his own newly discovered power of magnetism. A few of the father's patients were forthwith subjected to the manipulations of Mesmer, and the same symptoms were induced. He then tried his hand upon some paupers in the hospitals of Bern and Zurich, and succeeded, according to his own account, but no other persons, in curing an ophthalmia and a gutta serena. With memorials of these achievements he returned to Vienna in the hope of silencing his enemies, or at least forcing them to respect his newly acquired reputation and to examine his system more attentively. His second appearance in that capital was not more auspicious than the first. He undertook to cure a Mademoiselle Paradis, who was quite blind and subject to convulsions. He magnetized her several times, and then declared that she was cured. At least, if she was not, it was her fault, and not his. An eminent oculist of that day, named Bath, went to visit her, and declared that she was as blind as ever, while her family said she was as much subject to convulsions as before. Mesmer persisted that she was cured. Like the French philosopher, he would not allow facts to interfere with his theory. He declared that there was a conspiracy against him, and that Mademoiselle Paradis, at the instigation of her family, feigned blindness in order to injure his reputation. The consequences of this pretended cure taught Mesmer that Vienna was not the sphere for him. Paris, the idle, the debauched, the pleasure-hunting, the novelty-loving, was the scene for a philosopher like him, and thither he repaired accordingly. He arrived at Paris in 1778, and began modestly by making himself and his theory known to the principal physicians. At first, his encouragement was but slight. He found people more inclined to laugh at than to patronize him. But he was a man who had great confidence in himself, and of a perseverance which no difficulties could overcome. He hired a sumptuous apartment, which he opened to all comers who chose to make trial of the new power of nature. Monsieur d'Eslon, a physician of great reputation, became a convert, and from that time animal magnetism, or as some called it, mesmerism, became the fashion in Paris. The women were quite enthusiastic about it, and their admiring tattle wafted its fame through every grade of society. Mesmer was the rage, and high and low, rich and poor, credulous and unbelieving, all hastened to convince themselves of the power of this mighty magician who made such magnificent promises. Mesmer, who knew as well as any man living the influence of the imagination, determined that, on that score, nothing should be wanting to heighten the effect of the magnetic charm. In all Paris there was not a house so charmingly furnished as M. Mesmer's. Richly stained glass shed a dim religious light on his spacious saloons, which were almost covered with mirrors. Orange blossoms scented all the air of his corridors. Incense of the most expensive kinds burned in antique vases on his chimney pieces. Aeolian harps sighed melodious music from distant chambers, while sometimes a sweet female voice, from above or below, stole softly upon the mysterious silence that was kept in the house, and insisted upon from all visitors. "Was ever anything so delightful?" cried all the Mrs. Wititterlys of Paris, as they thronged to his house in search of pleasant excitement. "So wonderful!" said the pseudo-philosophers, who would believe anything if it were the fashion. "So amusing!" said the worn-out debauchees, who had drained the cup of sensuality to its dregs, and who longed to see lovely women in convulsions, with the hope that they might gain some new emotions from the sight. The following was the mode of operation. In the centre of the saloon was placed an oval vessel, about 4 feet in its longest diameter, and 1 foot deep. In this were laid a number of wine bottles, filled with magnetized water, well corked up, and disposed in radii, with their necks outwards. Water was then poured into the vessel so as just to cover the bottles, and filings of iron were thrown in occasionally to heighten the magnetic effect. The vessel was then covered with an iron cover pierced through with many holes, and was called the Mackay. From each hole issued a long movable rod of iron, which the patients were to apply to such parts of their bodies as were afflicted. Around this Mackay the patients were directed to sit, holding each other by the hand and pressing their knees together as closely as possible, to facilitate the passage of the magnetic fluid from one to the other. Then came in the assistant magnetizers, generally strong, handsome young men, to pour into the patient from their fingertips fresh streams of the wondrous fluid. They embraced the patient between the knees, rubbed them gently down the spine and the course of the nerves, using gentle pressure upon the breasts of the ladies, and staring them out of countenance to magnetize them by the eye. All this time the most rigorous silence was maintained, with the exception of a few wild notes on the harmonica or the pianoforte, or the melodious voice of a hidden opera singer swelling softly at long intervals. Gradually the cheeks of the ladies began to glow, their imaginations to become inflamed, and off they went, one after the other, in convulsive fits. Some of them sobbed and tore their hair, others laughed till the tears ran from their eyes, while others shrieked and screamed and yelled till they became insensible altogether. This was the crisis of the delirium. In the midst of it, the chief actor made his appearance, waving his wand like Prospero, to work new wonders. Dressed in a long robe of lilac-coloured silk, richly embroidered with gold flowers, bearing in his hand a white magnetic rod, and with a look of dignity which would have sat well on an Eastern caliph, he marched with solemn strides into the room. He awed the still sensible by his eye, and the violence of their symptoms diminished. He stroked the insensible with his hands upon the eyebrows and down the spine, traced figures upon their breast and abdomen with his long white wand, and they were restored to consciousness. They became calm, acknowledged his power, and said they felt streams of cold or burning vapour passing through their frames, according as he waved his wand or his fingers before them. It is impossible, says M. Dupotet, to conceive the sensation which Mesmer's experiments created in Paris. No theological controversy in the earlier ages of the Catholic Church was ever conducted with greater bitterness. His adversaries denied the discovery, some calling him a quack, others a fool, and others again, like the Abbé Fiard, a man who had sold himself to the devil. His friends were as extravagant in their praise as his foes were in their censure. Paris was inundated with pamphlets upon the subject, as many defending as attacking the doctrine. At court the Queen expressed herself in favour of it, and nothing else was to be heard of in society. By the advice of M. d'Eslon, Mesmer challenged an examination of his doctrine by the Faculty of Medicine. He proposed to select 24 patients, 12 of whom he would treat magnetically, leaving the other 12 to be treated by the faculty according to the old and approved methods. He also stipulated that, to prevent disputes, the government should nominate certain persons who were not physicians to be present at the experiments, and that the object of the inquiry should be, not how these effects were produced, but whether they were really efficacious in the cure of any disease. The faculty objected to limit the inquiry in this manner, and the proposition fell to the ground. Mesmer now wrote to Marie Antoinette, with the view of securing her influence in obtaining for him the protection of government. He wished to have a chateau and its lands given to him, with a handsome yearly income, that he might be enabled to continue his experiments at leisure, untroubled by the persecution of his enemies. He hinted the duty of governments to support men of science, and expressed his fear that if he met no more encouragement, he should be compelled to carry his great discovery to some other land more willing to appreciate him. "In the eyes of your Majesty," said he, 400,000 or 500,000 francs applied to a good purpose are of no account. The welfare and happiness of your people are everything. My discovery ought to be received and rewarded with a munificence worthy of the monarch to whom I shall attach myself." The government at last offered him a pension of 20,000 francs, and the cross of the Order of St. Michael, if he had made any discovery in medicine, and would communicate it to physicians nominated by the king. The latter part of the proposition was not agreeable to Mesmer. He feared the unfavourable report of the king's physicians, and, breaking off the negotiation, spoke of his disregard of money and his wish to have his discovery at once recognized by the government. He then retired to Spa in a fit of disgust, upon pretence of drinking the waters for the benefit of his health. After he had left Paris, the Faculty of Medicine called upon M. d'Eslon for the third and last time to renounce the doctrine of animal magnetism, or be expelled from their body. M. d'Eslon, so far from doing this, declared that he had discovered new secrets, and solicited further examination. A royal commission of the Faculty of Medicine was, in consequence, appointed on the 12th of March, 1784, seconded by another commission of the Académie des Sciences, to investigate the phenomena and report upon them. The first commission was composed of the principal physicians of Paris, while among the eminent men comprised in the latter were Benjamin Franklin, Lavoisier, and Bailly the historian of astronomy. Mesmer was formally invited to appear before this body, but absented himself from day to day upon one pretence or another. M. d'Eslon was more honest, because he thoroughly believed in the phenomena, which it is to be questioned if Mesmer ever did, and regularly attended the sittings and performed experiments. Bailly has thus described the scenes of which he was a witness in the course of this investigation. The sick persons, arranged in great numbers and in several rows around the Mackay, receive the magnetism by all these means: by the iron rods which convey it to them from the Mackay, by the cords wound round their bodies, by the connection of the thumb, which conveys to them the magnetism of their neighbours, and by the sounds of a pianoforte or of an agreeable voice diffusing the magnetism in the air. The patients were also directly magnetized by means of the finger and wand of the magnetizer moved slowly before their faces, above or behind their heads, and on the diseased parts, always observing the direction of the holes. The magnetizer acts by fixing his eyes on them, but above all, they are magnetized by the application of his hands, and the pressure of his fingers on the hypochondries and on the regions of the abdomen, an application often continued for a long time, sometimes for several hours. Meanwhile, the patients in their different conditions present a very varied picture. Some are calm, tranquil, and experience no effect. Others cough, spit, feel slight pains, local or general heat, and have sweatings. Others again are agitated and tormented with convulsions. These convulsions are remarkable in regard to the number affected with them, to their duration and force. As soon as one begins to be convulsed, several others are affected. The commissioners have observed some of these convulsions last more than 3 hours. They are accompanied with expectorations of a muddy viscous water, brought away by violent efforts. Sometimes streaks of blood have been observed in this fluid. These convulsions are characterized by the precipitous, involuntary motion of all the limbs, and of the whole body, by the contraction of the throat, by the leaping motions of the hypochondria and the epigastrium, by the dimness and wandering of the eyes, by piercing shrieks, tears, sobbing, and immoderate laughter. They are preceded or followed by a state of languor or reverie, a kind of depression, and sometimes drowsiness. The smallest sudden noise occasions a shuddering, and it was remarked that the change of measure in the airs played on the pianoforte had a great influence on the patients. A quicker motion, a livelier melody, agitated them more, and renewed the vivacity of their convulsions. Nothing is more astonishing than the spectacle of these convulsions. One who has not seen them can form no idea of them. The spectator is as much astonished at the profound repose of one portion of the patients as at the agitation of the rest, at the various accidents which are repeated, and at the sympathies which are exhibited. Some of the patients may be seen devoting their attention exclusively to one another, rushing towards each other with open arms, smiling, soothing, and manifesting every symptom of attachment and affection. All are under the power of the magnetizer. It matters not in what state of drowsiness they may be. The sound of his voice, a look, a motion of his hand, brings them out of it. Among the patients in convulsions there are always observed a great many women and very few men. These experiments lasted for about 5 months. They had hardly commenced before Mesmer, alarmed at the loss both of fame and profit, determined to return to Paris. Some patients of rank and fortune, enthusiastic believers in his doctrine, had followed him to Spa. One of them, named Bergasse, proposed to open a subscription for him of 100 shares at 100 louis each, on condition that he would disclose his secret to the subscribers, who were to be permitted to make whatever use they pleased of it. Mesmer readily embraced the proposal, and such was the infatuation that the subscription was not only filled in a few days, but exceeded by no less a sum than 140,000 francs. With this fortune he returned to Paris, and recommenced his experiments, while the Royal Commission continued theirs. His admiring pupils, who had paid him so handsomely for his instructions, spread his fame over the country, and established in all the principal towns of France societies of harmony, for trying experiments and curing all diseases by means of magnetism. Some of these societies were a scandal to morality, being joined by profligate men of depraved appetites, who took a disgusting delight in witnessing young girls in convulsions. Many of the pretended magnetizers were asserted at the time to be notorious libertines, who took that opportunity of gratifying their passions. At last the commissioners published their report, which was drawn up by the illustrious and unfortunate Bailly. For clearness of reasoning and strict impartiality it has never been surpassed. After detailing the various experiments made and their results, they came to the conclusion that the only proof advanced in support of animal magnetism was the effects it produced on the human body. that those effects could be produced without passes or other magnetic manipulations, that all these manipulations and passes and ceremonies never produce any effect at all, if employed without the patient's knowledge, and that therefore imagination did, and animal magnetism did not, account for the phenomena. This report was the ruin of Mesmer's reputation in France. He quitted Paris shortly after, with the 340,000 francs which had been subscribed by his admirers, and retired to his own country, where he died in 1815, at the advanced age of 81. But the seeds he had sown fructified of themselves, nourished and brought to maturity by the kindly warmth of popular credulity. Imitators sprang up in France, Germany, and England, more extravagant than their master, and claiming powers for the new science which its founder had never dreamt of. Among others, Cagliostro made good use of the delusion in extending his claims to be considered a master of the occult sciences. But he made no discoveries worthy to be compared to those of the Marquis de Puysegur and the Chevalier Barbarin, honest men who began by deceiving themselves before they deceived others. End of Chapter 7, Part 2.
Chapter 7, Part 3 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, The Magnetisers, Part 3. The Marquis de Puysegur, the owner of a considerable estate at Busancy, was one of those who had entered into the subscription for Mesmer. After that individual had quitted France, he retired to Busancy with his brother to try animal magnetism upon his tenants, and cure the country people of all manner of diseases. He was a man of great simplicity and much benevolence, and not only magnetised but fed the sick that flocked around him. In all the neighbourhood, and indeed within a circumference of 20 miles, he was looked upon as endowed with a power almost divine. His great discovery, as he called it, was made by chance. One day he had magnetised his gardener, and observing him to fall into a deep sleep, it occurred to him that he would address a question to him, as he would have done to a natural somnambulist. He did so, and the man replied with much clearness and precision. Monsieur de Puysegur was agreeably surprised. He continued his experiments, and found that, in this state of magnetic somnambulism, the soul of the sleeper was enlarged, and brought into more intimate communication with all nature, and more especially with him, Monsieur de Puysegur. He found that all further manipulations were unnecessary, that without speaking or making any sign he could convey his will to the patient, that he could in fact converse with him, soul to soul, without the employment of any physical operation whatever. Simultaneously with this marvellous discovery he made another, which reflects equal credit upon his understanding. Like Valentine Greatrax, he found it hard work to magnetise all that came, that he had not even time to take the repose and relaxation which were necessary for his health. In this emergency he hit upon a clever expedient. He heard Mesmer say that he could magnetise bits of wood. Why should he not be able to magnetise a whole tree? It was no sooner thought than done. There was a large elm on the village green at Busancy, under which the peasant girls used to dance on festive occasions, and the old men to sit, drinking their vin du pays, on the fine summer evenings. Monsieur de Puysegur proceeded to this tree and magnetised it, by first touching it with his hands, and then retiring a few steps from it, all the while directing streams of the magnetic fluid from the branches towards the trunk, and from the trunk towards the root. This done, he caused circular seats to be erected round it, and cords suspended from it in all directions. When the patients had seated themselves, they twisted the cords round the diseased parts of their bodies, and held one another firmly by their thumbs to form a direct channel of communication for the passage of the fluid. M. de Puysegur now had two hobbies, the man with the enlarged soul and the magnetic elm. The infatuation of himself and his patients cannot be better expressed than in his own words. Writing to his brother on the 17th of May 1784, he says, "If you do not come, my dear friend, you will not see my extraordinary man, for his health is now almost quite restored. I continue to make use of the happy power for which I am indebted to M. Mesmer. Every day I bless his name, for I am very useful, and produce many salutary effects on all the sick poor in the neighbourhood. They flock around my tree. There were more than 130 of them this morning. It is the best Mackay possible. Not a leaf of it but communicates health. All feel, more or less, the good effects of it. You will be delighted to see the charming picture of humanity which this presents. I have only one regret. It is that I cannot touch all who come. But my magnetized man, my intelligence, sets me at ease. He teaches me what conduct I should adopt. According to him, it is not at all necessary that I should touch every one. A look, a gesture, even a wish is sufficient. And it is one of the most ignorant peasants of the country that teaches me this. When he is in a crisis, I know of nothing more profound, more prudent, more clear-sighted, clairvoyant, than he is." In another letter, describing his first experiment with the magnetic tree, he says, "Yesterday evening I brought my first patient to it. As soon as I had put the cord round him, he gazed at the tree, and with an air of astonishment which I cannot describe, exclaimed, 'What is it that I see there?' His head then sunk down, and he fell into a perfect fit of somnambulism. At the end of an hour I took him home to his house again, when I restored him to his senses. Several men and women came to tell him what he had been doing. He maintained it was not true, that, weak as he was and scarcely able to walk, it would have been scarcely possible for him to have gone downstairs and walked to the tree. To-day I have repeated the experiment on him, and with the same success. I own to you that my head turns round with pleasure to think of the good I do. Madame de Puysegur, the friends she has with her, my servants, and in fact all who are near me, feel an amazement, mingled with admiration, which cannot be described, but they do not experience the half of my sensations. Without my tree, which gives me rest, and which will give me still more, I should be in a state of agitation, inconsistent, I believe, with my health. I exist too much, if I may be allowed to use the expression." In another letter he descants still more poetically upon his gardener with the enlarged soul. He says, "It is from this simple man, this tall and stout rustic, 23 years of age, enfeebled by disease, or rather by sorrow, and therefore the more predisposed to be affected by any great natural agent, it is from this man, I repeat, that I derive instruction and knowledge. When in the magnetic state he is no longer a peasant who can hardly utter a single sentence. He is a being, to describe whom I cannot find a name. I need not speak, I have only to think before him, when he instantly understands and answers me. Should anybody come into the room he sees him if I desire it, but not else, and addresses him and says what I wish to say. Not indeed exactly as I dictate to him, but as truth requires. When he wants to add more than I deem it prudent strangers should hear, I stop the flow of his ideas and of his conversation in the middle of a word, and give it quite a different turn." Among other persons attracted to Busancy by the report of these extraordinary occurrences was M. Cloquet, the receiver of finance. His appetite for the marvellous being somewhat insatiable, he readily believed all that was told him by M. de Puysegur. He also has left a record of what he saw and what he credited, which throws a still clearer light upon the progress of the delusion. He says that the patients he saw in the magnetic state had an appearance of deep sleep, during which all the physical faculties were suspended, to the advantage of the intellectual faculties. The eyes of the patient were closed, the sense of hearing was abolished, and they awoke only at the voice of their magnetizer. If any one touched a patient during a crisis, or even the chair on which he was seated, said M. Cloquet, it would cause him much pain and suffering, and throw him into convulsions. During the crisis they possess an extraordinary and supernatural power, by which, on touching a patient presenting to them, they can feel what part of his body is diseased, even by merely passing their hand over the clothes. Another singularity was, that these sleepers who could thus discover diseases, see into the interior of other men's stomachs, and point out remedies, remembered absolutely nothing after the magnetizer thought proper to disenchant them. The time that elapsed between their entering the crisis and their coming out of it was obliterated. Not only had the magnetizer the power of making himself heard by the somnambulists, but he could make them follow him by merely pointing his finger at them from a distance, though they had their eyes the whole time completely closed. Such was the animal magnetism under the auspices of the Marquis de Puysegur. While he was exhibiting these phenomena around his elm tree, a magnetizer of another class appeared in Lyons, in the person of the Chevalier de Barbarin. This gentleman thought that the effort of will, without any of the paraphernalia of wands or baquets, was sufficient to throw patients into the magnetic sleep. He tried it and succeeded. By sitting at the bedside of his patients, and praying that they might be magnetized, they went off into a state very similar to that of the persons who fell under the notice of M. de Puysegur. In the course of time a very considerable number of magnetizers, acknowledging Barbarin for their model, and called after him Barbarinists, appeared in different parts, and were believed to have effected some remarkable cures. In Sweden and Germany this sect of fanatics increased rapidly, and were called spiritualists, to distinguish them from the followers of M. de Puysegur, who were called experimentalists. They maintained that all of the effects of animal magnetism, which Mesmer believed to be produced by a magnetic fluid dispersed through nature, were produced by the mere effort of one human soul acting upon another; that when a connection had been established between a magnetizer and his patient, the former could communicate his influence to the latter from any distance, even hundreds of miles, by the will. One of them thus described the blessed state of a magnetic patient. In such a man, animal instinct ascends to the highest degree admissible in the world. The clairvoyant is then a pure animal, without any admixture of matter. His observations are those of a spirit. He is similar to God. His eye penetrates all the secrets of nature. When his attention is fixed on any of the objects of this world, on his disease, his death, his well-beloved, his friends, his relations, his enemies, in spirit he sees them acting. He penetrates into the causes and the consequences of their actions, and becomes a physician, a prophet, a divine. Let us now see what progress these mysteries made in England. In the year 1788, Dr. Maynarduk, who had been a pupil, first of Mesmer and afterwards of Deslon, arrived in Bristol and gave public lectures upon magnetism. His success was quite extraordinary. People of rank and fortune hastened from London to Bristol to be magnetized, or to place themselves under his tuition. Dr. George Winter, in his History of Animal Magnetism, gives the following list of them. They amounted to 127, among whom there were 1 duke, 1 duchess, 1 marchioness, 2 countesses, 1 earl, 1 baron, 3 baronesses, 1 bishop, 5 right honourable gentlemen and ladies, 2 baronets, 7 members of Parliament, 1 clergyman, 2 physicians, 7 surgeons, besides 92 gentlemen and ladies of respectability. He afterwards established himself in London, where he performed with equal success. He began by publishing proposals to the ladies for the formation of a Hygiene Society. In this paper he vaunted highly the curative effects of animal magnetism, and took great credit to himself for being the first person to introduce it into England, and thus concluded: "As this method of cure is not confined to sex or college education, and the fair sex being in general the most sympathizing part of the creation, and most immediately concerned in the health and care of its offspring, I think myself bound in gratitude to you ladies, for the partiality you have shown me in midwifery, to contribute, as far as lies in my power, to render you additionally useful and valuable to the community. With this view I propose forming my Hygiene Society, to be incorporated with that of Paris. As soon as 20 ladies have given in their names, the day shall be appointed for the first meeting at my house, when they are to pay 15 guineas, which will include the whole expense." Hannah More, in a letter addressed to Horace Walpole in 1788, speaks of the demoniacal mummeries of Dr. Maynarduk and says that he was in a fair way of gaining £100,000 by them, as Mesmer had done by his exhibitions in Paris. So much curiosity was excited by the subject, that about the same time a man named Holloway gave a course of lectures on animal magnetism in London, at the rate of 5 guineas for each pupil, and realised a considerable fortune. Loutherbourg the painter and his wife followed the same profitable trade, and such was the infatuation of the people to be witness of their strange manipulations, that at times upwards of 3,000 persons crowded around their house at Hammersmith, unable to gain admission. The tickets sold at prices varying from 1 to 3 guineas. Loutherbourg performed his cures by the touch, after the manner of Valentine Greatrax, and finally pretended to a divine mission. An account of his miracles, as they were called, was published in 1789, entitled A List of New Cures performed by Mr. and Mrs. de Loutherbourg of Hammersmith Terrace, without medicine, by a lover of the Lamb of God, dedicated to his Grace the Archbishop of Canterbury. The lover of the Lamb of God was a half-crazy old woman, named Mary Pratt, who conceived for Mr. and Mrs. de Loutherbourg a veneration which almost prompted her to worship them. She chose for the motto of her pamphlet a verse in the 13th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles: "Behold, ye despisers, and wonder and perish, for I will work a work in your days which ye shall not believe, though a man declare it unto you." Attempting to give a religious character to the cures of the painter, she thought a woman was the proper person to make them known, since the apostle had declared that a man should not be able to conquer the incredulity of the people. She stated that from Christmas 1788 to July 1789, de Loutherbourg and his wife had cured 2,000 people, having been made proper recipients to receive divine manuductions, which heavenly and divine influx, coming from the radix God, his divine majesty, had most graciously bestowed upon them to diffuse healing to all, be they deaf, dumb, blind, lame, or halt. In her dedication to the Archbishop of Canterbury she implored him to compose a new form of prayer, to be used in all churches and chapels, that nothing might impede this inestimable gift from having its due course. She further entreated all the magistrates and men of authority in the land to wait on Mr. and Mrs. de Loutherbourg, to consult with them on the immediate erection of a large hospital, with the pool of Bethesda attached to it. All the Magnetisers were scandalised at the preposterous jabber of this old woman, and de Loutherbourg appears to have left London to avoid her, continuing, however, in conjunction with his wife, the fantastic tricks which had turned the brain of this poor fanatic, and deluded many others who pretended to more sense than she had. From this period until 1798, magnetism excited little or no attention in England. An attempt to revive the belief in it was made in that year, but it was in the shape of mineral rather than of animal magnetism. One Benjamin Douglas Perkins, an American, practising as a surgeon in Leicester Square, invented and took out a patent for the celebrated metallic tractors. He pretended that these tractors, which were 2 small pieces of metal strongly magnetised, something resembling the steel plates which were first brought into notice by Father Hell, would cure gout, rheumatism, palsy, and, in fact, almost every disease the human frame was subject to, if implied externally to the afflicted part, and moved about gently, touching the surface only. The most wonderful stories soon obtained general circulation, and the press groaned with pamphlets, all vaunting the curative effects of the tractors, which were sold at 5 guineas the pair. Perkins gained money rapidly. Gouty subjects forgot their pains in the presence of this new remedy, the rheumatism fled at its approach, and the toothache, which is often cured by the mere sight of a dentist, vanished before Perkins and his marvellous steel plates. The Benevolent Society of Friends, of whose body he was a member, warmly patronised the invention. Desirous that the poor who could not afford to pay Mr. Perkins 5 guineas or even 5 shillings for his tractors should also share in the benefits of that sublime discovery, they subscribed a large sum and built an hospital, called the Perkinean Institution, in which all comers might be magnetised free of cost. In the course of a few months they were in very general use, and their lucky inventor in possession of £5,000. Dr. Haygarth, an eminent physician at Bath, recollecting the influence of imagination in the cure of disease, hit upon an expedient to try the real value of the tractors. Perkins' cures were too well established to be doubted, and Dr. Haygarth, without gainsaying them, quietly, but in the face of numerous witnesses, exposed the delusion under which people laboured with respect to the curative medium. He suggested to Dr. Falconer that they should make wooden tractors, paint them to resemble the steel ones, and see if the very same effects would not be produced. 5 patients were chosen from the hospital in Bath upon whom to operate. 4 of them suffered severely from chronic rheumatism in the ankle, knee, wrist, and hip, and the 5th had been afflicted for several months with the gout. On the day appointed for the experiments, Dr. Haygarth and his friends assembled at the hospital, and with much solemnity brought forth the fictitious tractors. 4 out of the 5 patients said their pains were immediately relieved, and 3 of them said that they were not only relieved but very much benefited. 1 felt his knee warmer, and said he could walk across the room. He tried and succeeded, although on the previous day he had not been able to stir. The gouty man felt his pains diminish rapidly, and was quite easy for 9 hours, until he went to bed when the twitching began again. On the following day the real tractors were applied to all the patients, when they described their symptoms in nearly the same terms. To make still more sure, the experiment was tried in the Bristol Infirmary, a few weeks afterwards, on a man who had rheumatic affection in the shoulder, so severe as to incapacitate him from lifting his hand from his knee. The fictitious tractors were brought and applied to the afflicted part, one of the physicians, to add solemnity to the scene, drawing a stopwatch from his pocket to calculate the time exactly, while another, with a pen in his hand, sat down to write the change of symptoms from minute to minute as they occurred. In less than 4 minutes the man felt so much relieved that he lifted his hand several inches without any pain in the shoulder. An account of these matters was published by Dr. Haygarth in a small volume entitled "Of the Imagination, as a Cause and Cure of Disorders exemplified by Fictitious Tractors." The exposure was a coup de grace to the system of Mr. Perkins. His friends and patrons, still unwilling to confess that they had been deceived, tried the tractors upon sheep, cows, and horses, alleging that the animals received benefit from the metallic plates, but none at all from the wooden ones. But they found nobody to believe them. The Perkinian institution fell into neglect, and Perkins made his exit from England, carrying with him about £10,000 to soothe his declining years in the good city of Pennsylvania. Thus was magnetism laughed out of England for a time. In France the Revolution left men no leisure for studying it. The Société de l'Harmonie of Strasbourg and other great towns lingered for a while, till sterner matters occupying men's attention, they were one after the other abandoned both by pupils and professors. The system, thus driven from the first 2 nations of Europe, took refuge among the dreamy philosophers of Germany. There the wonders of the magnetic sleep grew more and more wonderful every day. The patients acquired the gift of prophecy, their vision extended over all the surface of the globe. They could hear and see with their toes and fingers, and read unknown languages, and understand them too, by merely having the book placed on their stomachs. Ignorant peasants, when once entranced by the grand mesmeric fluid, could spout philosophy diviner than Plato ever wrote, descant upon the mysteries of the mind with more eloquence and truth than the profoundest metaphysicians the world ever saw, and solve knotty points of divinity with as much ease as waking men could undo their shoe buckles. During the first 12 years of the present century little was heard of animal magnetism in any country of Europe. Even the Germans forgot their airy fancies, recalled to the knowledge of this everyday world by the roar of Napoleon's cannon and the fall or the establishment of kingdoms. During this period a cloud of obscurity hung over the science, which was not dispersed until M. Deleuze published in 1813 his Histoire critique du magnétisme animal. This work gave a new impulse to the half-forgotten fancy. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books again waged war upon each other for question of its truth or falsehood, and many eminent men in the profession of medicine recommenced inquiry with an earnest design to discover the truth. The assertions made in the celebrated treatise of Deleuze are thus summed up. There is a fluid continually escaping from the human body, and forming an atmosphere around us which, as it has no determined current, produces no sensible effects on surrounding individuals. It is, however, capable of being directed by the will, and when so directed, is sent forth in currents, with a force corresponding to the energy we possess. Its motion is similar to that of the rays from burning bodies. It possesses different qualities in different individuals. It is capable of a high degree of concentration, and exists also in trees. The will of the magnetizer, guided by a motion of the hand several times repeated in the same direction, can fill a tree with this fluid. Most persons, when this fluid is poured into them from the body and by the will of the magnetizer, feel a sensation of heat or cold, when he passes his hand before them without even touching them. Some persons, when sufficiently charged with this fluid, fall into a state of somnambulism or magnetic ecstasy, and when in this state, they see the fluid encircling the magnetizer like a halo of light, and issuing in luminous streams from his mouth and nostrils, his head and hands, possessing a very agreeable smell and communicating a particular taste to food and water. One would think that these notions were quite enough to be insisted upon by any physician who wished to be considered sane, but they form only a small portion of the wondrous things related by M. Deleuze. He further said, when magnetism produces somnambulism, the person who is in this state acquires a prodigious extension of all his faculties. Several of his external organs, especially those of sight and hearing, become inactive, but the sensations which depend upon them take place internally. Seeing and hearing are carried on by the magnetic fluid, which transmits the impressions immediately and without the intervention of any nerves or organs directly to the brain. Thus the somnambulist, though his eyes and ears are closed, not only sees and hears, but sees and hears much better than he does when awake. In all things he feels the will of the magnetizer, although that will be not expressed. He sees into the interior of his own body, and the most secret organization of the bodies of all those who may be put en rapport or in magnetic connection with him. Most commonly, he only sees those parts which are diseased and disordered, and intuitively prescribes a remedy for them. He has prophetic visions and sensations which are generally true, but sometimes erroneous. He expresses himself with astonishing eloquence and facility. He is not free from vanity. He becomes a more perfect being of his own accord for a certain time if guided wisely by the magnetizer, but wanders if he is ill-directed. According to M. Deleuze, any person could become a magnetizer and produce these effects by conforming to the following conditions and acting upon the following rules. Forget for a while all your knowledge of physics and metaphysics. Remove from your mind all objections that may occur. Imagine that it is in your power to take the malady in hand and throw it on one side. Never reason for 6 weeks after you have commenced the study. Have an active desire to do good, a firm belief in the power of magnetism, and an entire confidence in employing it. In short, repel all doubts, desire success, and act with simplicity and attention. That is to say, be very credulous, be very persevering, reject all past experience, and do not listen to reason, and you are a magnetizer after M. Deleuze's own heart. Having brought yourself into this edifying state, remove from the patient all persons who might be troublesome to you. Keep with you only the necessary witnesses, a single person if need be. Desire them not to occupy themselves in any way with the processes you employ and the effects which result from them, but to join with you in the desire of doing good to your patient. Arrange yourself so as neither to be too hot nor too cold, and in such a manner that nothing may obstruct the freedom of your motions, and take precautions to prevent interruption during the sitting. Make your patient, then, sit as commodiously as possible, and place yourself opposite to him, on a seat a little more elevated, in such a manner that his knees may be betwixt yours and your feet at the side of his. First request him to resign himself, to think of nothing, not to perplex himself by examining the effects which may be produced, to banish all fear, to surrender himself to hope, and not to be disturbed or discouraged if the action of magnetism should cause in him momentary pains. After having collected yourself, take his thumbs between your fingers in such a way that the internal part of your thumbs may be in contact with the internal part of his, and then fix your eyes upon him. You must remain from 2 to 5 minutes in this situation, or until you feel an equal heat between your thumbs and his. This done, you will withdraw your hands, removing them to the right and left, and at the same time turning them till their internal surface be outwards, and you will raise them to the height of the head. You will now place them upon the 2 shoulders, and let them remain there about a minute. afterwards drawing them gently along the arms to the extremities of the fingers, touching very slightly as you go. You will renew this pass 5 or 6 times, always turning your hands, and removing them a little from the body before you lift them. You will then place them above the head, and after holding them there for an instant, lower them, passing them before the face, at the distance of 1 or 2 inches, down to the pit of the stomach. There you will stop them 2 minutes also, putting your thumbs upon the pit of the stomach and the rest of your fingers below the ribs. You will then descend slowly along the body to the knees, or rather, if you can do so without deranging yourself, to the extremity of the feet. You will repeat the same processes several times during the remainder of the sitting. You will also occasionally approach your patient so as to place your hands behind his shoulders, in order to descend slowly along the spine of the back and the thighs, down to the knees or the feet. After the first passes, you may dispense with putting your hands upon the head, and make the subsequent passes upon the arms, beginning at the shoulders, and upon the body, beginning at the stomach. Such was the process of magnetizing recommended by Deleuze. That delicate, fanciful, and nervous women, when subjected to it, should have worked themselves into convulsions will be readily believed by the sturdiest opponent of animal magnetism. To sit in a constrained posture, be stared out of countenance by a fellow who enclosed her knees between his, while he made passes upon different parts of her body, was quite enough to throw any weak woman into a fit, especially if she were predisposed to hysteria, and believed in the efficacy of the treatment. It should be just as evident that those of stronger minds and healthier bodies should be sent to sleep by the process. That these effects have been produced by these means, there are thousands of instances to show. But are they testimony in favour of animal magnetism? Do they prove the existence of the magnetic fluid? It needs neither magnetism nor ghost from the grave to tell us that silence, monotony, and long recumbency in one position must produce sleep, or that excitement, imitation, and a strong imagination acting upon a weak body will bring on convulsions. M. Deleuze's book produced quite a sensation in France. The study was resumed with redoubled vigour. In the following year a journal was established devoted exclusively to the science, under the title of Annales du Magnétisme Animal, and shortly afterwards appeared the Bibliothèque du Magnétisme Animal, and many others. About the same time the Abbé Faria, the man of wonders, began to magnetize, and the belief being that he had more of the mesmeric fluid about him, and a stronger will than most men, he was very successful in his treatment. His experiments afford a convincing proof that imagination can operate all, and the supposed fluid none, of the results so confidently claimed as evidence of the new science. He placed his patients in an armchair, told them to shut their eyes, and then in a loud commanding voice pronounced the single word, "Sleep." He then used no manipulations whatever. He had no Mackay or conductor of the fluid, but he nevertheless succeeded in causing sleep in hundreds of patients. He boasted of having in his time produced 5,000 somnambulists by this method. It was often necessary to repeat the command 3 or 4 times, and if the patient still remained awake, the abbé got out of the difficulty by dismissing him from the chair, and declaring that he was incapable of being acted upon. And it should be especially remarked, that the magnetisers do not lay claim to universal efficacy for their fluid. The strong and the healthy cannot be magnetised. The incredulous cannot be magnetised. Those who reason upon cannot be magnetised. Those who firmly believe in it can be magnetised. The weak in body can be magnetised, and the weak in mind can be magnetised. And lest, from some cause or other, individuals of the latter classes should resist the magnetic charm, the apostles of the science declare that there are times when even they cannot be acted upon. The presence of one scorner or unbeliever may weaken the potency of the fluid and destroy its efficacy. In M. Deleuze's Instructions to a Magnetizer he expressly says, "Never magnetize before inquisitive persons." Here we conclude the subject, as it would serve no good purpose to extend to greater length the history of animal magnetism, especially at a time when many phenomena, the reality of which it is impossible to dispute, are daily occurring to startle and perplex the most learned, impartial, and truth-loving of mankind. Enough, however, has been stated to show that if there be some truth in magnetism, there has been much error, misconception, and exaggeration. Taking its history from the commencement, it can hardly be said to have been without its uses. To quote the words of Bailey in 1784, magnetism has not been altogether unavailing to the philosophy which condemns it. It is an additional fact to record among the errors of the human mind, and a great experiment on the strength of the imagination. Over that vast inquiry of the influence of mind over matter, an inquiry which the embodied intellect of mankind will never be able to fathom completely, it will at least have thrown a feeble and imperfect light. It will have afforded an additional proof of the strength of the unconquerable will, and the weakness of matter as compared with it. Another illustration of the words of the inspired psalmist, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. End of chapter 7, part 3. Read by MorganScorpion.
Chapter 8 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay. Influence of Politics and Religion on the Hair and Beard. Speak with respect and honor, both of the beard and the beard's owner. Hudibras. The famous declaration of St. Paul, that long hair was a shame unto a man, has been made the pretext for many singular enactments, both of civil and ecclesiastical governments. The fashion of the hair and the cut of the beard were state questions in France and England, from the establishment of Christianity until the 15th century. We find, too, that in much earlier times men were not permitted to do as they liked with their own hair. Alexander the Great thought that the beards of the soldiery afforded convenient handles for the enemy to lay hold of, preparatory to cutting off their heads, and, with the view of depriving them of this advantage, he ordered the whole of his army to be closely shaven. His notions of courtesy towards the enemy were quite different from those entertained by the North American Indians, and amongst whom it is held a point of honor to allow one chivalrous lock to grow, that the foe, in taking the scalp, may have something to catch hold of. At one time, long hair was the symbol of sovereignty in Europe. We learn from Gregory of Tours that among the successors of Clovis it was the exclusive privilege of the royal family to have their hair long and curled. The nobles, equal to kings in power, would not show any inferiority in this respect, and wore not only their hair, but their beards of an enormous length. This fashion lasted, with but slight changes, till the time of Louis the Debonair, but his successors up to Hugh Capet wore their hair short, by way of distinction. Even the serfs had set all regulation at defiance, and allowed their locks and beards to grow. At the time of the invasion of England by William the Conqueror, the Normans wore their hair very short. Harold, in his progress towards Hastings, sent forward spies to view the strength and number of the enemy. They reported, amongst other things, on their return, that the host did almost seem to be priests, because they had all their face and both their lips shaven. The fashion among the English at the time was to wear the hair long upon the head and the upper lip, but to shave the chin. When the haughty victors had divided the broad lands of the Saxon thanes and franklins among them, when tyranny of every kind was employed to make the English feel that they were indeed a subdued and broken nation, the latter encouraged the growth of their hair, that they might resemble as little as possible their cropped and shaven masters. This fashion was exceedingly displeasing to the clergy, and prevailed to a considerable extent in France and Germany. Towards the end of the 11th century it was decreed by the Pope, and zealously supported by the ecclesiastical authorities all over Europe, that such persons as wore long hair should be excommunicated while living, and not be prayed for when dead. William of Malmesbury relates that the famous St. Wulstan, Bishop of Worcester, was peculiarly indignant whenever he saw a man with long hair. He declaimed against the practice as one highly immoral, criminal, and beastly. He continually carried a small knife in his pocket, and whenever anybody offending in this respect knelt before him to receive his blessing, he would whip it out slyly and cut off a handful, and then, throwing it in his face, tell him to cut off all the rest, or he would go to hell. But fashion, which at times it is possible to move with a wisp, stands firm against a lever. A man preferred to run the risk of damnation to parting with the superfluity of their hair. In the time of Henry I, Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, found it necessary to republish the famous decree of excommunication and outlawry against the offenders. But as the court itself had begun to patronize curls, the fulminations of the church were unavailing. Henry I and his nobles wore their hair in long ringlets down their backs and shoulders, and became a scandalum magnatum in the eyes of the godly. One Serlo, the king's chaplain, was so grieved in spirit at the impiety of his master that he preached a sermon from the well-known text of St. Paul before the assembled court, in which he drew so dreadful a picture of the torments that awaited them in the other world, that several of them burst into tears and wrung their hair, as if they would have pulled it out by the roots. Henry himself was observed to weep. The priest, seeing the impression he had made, determined to strike while the iron was hot, and pulling a pair of scissors from his pocket, cut the king's hair in presence of them all. Several of the principal courtiers consented to do the like, and for a short time long hair appeared to be going out of fashion. But the courtiers thought, after the first glow of their penitence had been cooled by reflection, that the clerical Delilah had shorn them of their strength, and in less than 6 months they were as great sinners as ever. Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been a monk at Bec, in Normandy, and who had signalized himself in Rouen by the fierce opposition to long hair, was still anxious to work a reformation in this matter. But his pertinacity was far from pleasing to the king, who had finally made up his mind to wear ringlets. There were other disputes of a more serious nature between them, so that when the archbishop died the king was so glad to be rid of him that he allowed the seat remain vacant for 5 years. Still the cause had other advocates, and every pulpit in the land resounded with anathemas against that disobedient and long-haired generation. But all was of no avail. Stowe, in writing of this period, asserts on the authority of some more ancient chronicler, that men, forgetting their birth, transformed themselves by the length of their hairs into the semblance of womankind, and that when their hair decayed from age or other causes, they knit about their heads certain rolls and braidings of false hair. At last, accident turned the tide of fashion. A knight of the court, who was exceedingly proud of his beauteous locks, dreamed one night that as he lay in bed, the devil sprang upon him, and endeavoured to choke him with his own hair. He started in a fright, and actually found that he had a great quantity of hair in his mouth. Sorely stricken in conscience, and looking upon the dream as a warning from heaven, he set about the work of reformation, and cut off his luxuriant tresses the same night. The story was soon bruited abroad. Of course it was made the most of by the clergy, and the knight, being a man of influence and consideration, and the acknowledged leader of the fashion, his example, aided by priestly exhortations, was very generally imitated. Men appeared almost as decent as St. Wulstan himself would have wished, the dream of a dandy having proved more efficacious than the entreaties of a saint. But as Stowe informs us, scarcely was 1 year past when all that thought themselves courtiers fell into the former vice, and contended with women in their long hairs. Henry, the king, appears to have been quite uninfluenced by the dreams of others, for even his own would not induce him a second time to undergo a cropping from priestly shears. It is said that he was much troubled at this time by disagreeable visions. Having offended the church in this and other respects, he could get no sound, refreshing sleep, and used to imagine that he saw all the bishops, abbots, and monks of every degree standing around his bedside, and threatening to belabor him with their pastoral staves, which sight, we are told, so frightened him that he often started naked out of his bed, and attacked the phantoms sword in hand. Grimbaldi, his physician, who, like most of his fraternity at that day, was an ecclesiastic, never hinting that his dreams were the result of a bad digestion, but told him to shave his head, be reconciled to the Church, and reform himself with alms and prayer. But he would not take this good advice, and it was not until he had nearly drowned a year afterwards in a violent storm at sea that he repented of his evil ways, cut his hair short, and paid proper deference to the wishes of the clergy. In France, the thunders of the Vatican with regard to long curly hair were hardly more respected than in England. Louis VII, however, was more obedient than his brother king, and cropped himself as closely as a monk, to the great sorrow of all the gallants of his court. His queen, the gay, haughty, and pleasure-seeking Eleanor of Guyenne, never admired him in this trim, and continually reproached him with imitating, not only the head-dress, but the asceticism of the monks. From this cause a coldness arose between them. The lady proving at last unfaithful to her shaven and indifferent lord, they were divorced, and the kings of France lost the rich provinces of Guyenne and Poitou, which were her dowry. She soon after bestowed her hand and her possessions upon Henry, Duke of Normandy, afterwards Henry II of England, and thus gave the English sovereigns that strong footing in France, which was for so many centuries the cause of such long and bloody wars between the nations. When the Crusades had drawn all the smart young fellows into Palestine, the clergy did not find it so difficult to convince the staid burghers who remained in Europe of the enormity of long hair. During the absence of Richard Coeur de Lion, his English subjects not only cut their hair close, but shaved their faces. William Fitzosbert, or Longbeard, the great demagogue of that day, reintroduced among the people who claimed to be of Saxon origin the fashion of long hair. He did this with the view of making them as unlike as possible to the citizens and the Normans. He wore his own beard hanging down to his waist, from whence the name by which he is best known to posterity. The Church never showed itself so great an enemy to the beard as to the long hair on the head. It generally allowed fashion to take its own course, both with regard to the chin and the upper lip. This fashion varied continually, for we find that, in little more than a century after the time of Richard I, when beards were short, that they had again become so long as to be mentioned in the famous epigram made by the Scots, who visited London in 1327, when David, son of Robert Bruce, was married to Joan, the sister of King Edward. This epigram, which was stuck on the church door of St. Peter's Stangate, ran as follows: Long beards heartless, painted hoods witless, grey coats graceless, make England thriftless. When the Emperor Charles V ascended the throne of Spain, he had no beard. It was not to be expected that the obsequious parasites who also surround a monarch could presume to look more virile than their master. Immediately all the courtiers appeared beardless, with the exception of such few grave old men as had outgrown the influence of fashion, and who had determined to die bearded as they had lived. Sober people in general saw this revolution with sorrow and alarm, and thought that every manly virtue would be banished with the beard. It became at the time a common saying, Desde que no hay barba, no hay más alma. We have no longer souls since we have lost our beards. In France also the beard fell into disrepute after the death of Henry IV, from the mere reason that his successor was too young to have one. Some of the more immediate friends of the great Béarnais, and his minister Sully among the rest, refused to part with their beards, notwithstanding the jeers of the new generation. Who does not remember the division of England into the two great parties of Roundheads and Cavaliers? In those days every species of vice and iniquity was thought by the Puritans to lurk in the long curly tresses of the monarchist, while the latter imagined that their opponents were as destitute of wit, of wisdom, and of virtue as they were of hair. A man's locks were the symbol of his creed, both in politics and religion. The more abundant the hair, the more scant the faith, and the balder the head, the more sincere the piety. But among all the instances of the interference of governments with men's hair, the most extraordinary, not only for its daring, but for its success, is that of Peter the Great in 1705. By this time fashion had condemned the beard in every other country in Europe, and with a voice more potent than popes or emperors, had banished it from civilized society. But this only made the Russians cling more fondly to their ancient ornament, as a mark to distinguish them from foreigners, whom they hated. Peter, however, resolved that they should be shaven. If he had been a man deeply read in history, he might have hesitated before he attempted so despotic an attack upon the time-hallowed customs and prejudices of his countrymen. But he was not. He did not know or consider the danger of the innovation. He only listened to the promptings of his own indomitable will, and his fiat went forth, that not only the army, but all ranks of citizens, from the nobles to the serfs, should shave their beards. A certain time was given, that people might get over the first throes of their repugnance, after which every man who chose to retain his beard was to pay a tax of 100 roubles. The priests and the serfs were put on a lower footing, and allowed to retain theirs upon payment of a kopeck every time they passed the gate of a city. Great discontent existed in consequence, but the dreadful fate of the Strelitzes was too recent to be forgotten, and thousands who had the will had not the courage to revolt. As is well remarked by a writer in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, they thought it wiser to cut off their beards than to run the risk of incensing a man who would make no scruple in cutting off their heads. Wiser, too, than the popes and bishops of a former age, he did not threaten them with eternal damnation, but made them pay in hard cash the penalty of their disobedience. For many years a very considerable revenue was collected from this source. The collectors gave in receipt for its payment a small copper coin, struck expressly for the purpose, and called the Borodovia, or the bearded. On one side it bore the figure of a nose, mouth, and mustaches, with a long bushy beard, surmounted by the words Doi Vieti, money received, the whole encircled by a wreath, and stamped with the black eagle of Russia. On the reverse it bore the date of the year. Every man who chose to wear a beard was obliged to produce this receipt on his entry into a town. Those who were refractory and refused to pay the tax were thrown into prison. Since that day the rulers of modern Europe have endeavored to persuade rather than to force in all matters pertaining to fashion. The Vatican troubles itself no more about beards or ringlets, and men may become hairy as bears, if such is their fancy, without fear of excommunication or deprivation of their political rights. Folly has taken a new start, and cultivates the mustache. Even upon this point governments will not let men alone. Religion as yet has not meddled with it, but perhaps it will. And politics already influence it considerably. Before the Revolution of 1830, neither the French nor Belgian citizens were remarkable for their mustaches, but after that event there was hardly a shopkeeper, either in Paris or Brussels, whose upper lip did not suddenly become hairy with real or mock mustaches. During a temporary triumph gained by the Dutch soldiers over the citizens of Louvain, in October 1830, it became a standing joke against the patriots that they shaved their faces clean immediately, and the wits of the Dutch army asserted that they had gathered mustaches enough from the denuded lips of the Belgians to stuff mattresses for all the sick and wounded in their hospital. The last folly of this kind is still more recent. In the German newspapers of August 1838 appeared an ordinance signed by the King of Bavaria, forbidding civilians, on any pretence whatever, to wear moustaches, and commanding the police and other authorities to arrest and cause to be shaved the offending parties. Strange to say, adds Le Droit, the journal from which this account is taken, moustaches disappeared immediately, like leaves from the trees in autumn. Everybody made haste to obey the royal order, and not one person was arrested. The King of Bavaria, a rhymester of some celebrity, has taken a good many poetical licenses in his time. His license in this matter appears neither poetical nor reasonable. It is to be hoped that he will not take it into his royal head to make his subjects shave theirs. Nothing but that is wanting to complete their degradation. End of chapter 8. End of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 1, by Charles Mackay.